My name is Thomas, and today I'm going to tell you about the morning I woke up and couldn't silence the screaming in my own mind, and how God spoke a truth that would teach me the difference between the noise of anxiety and the voice of peace. Before we continue, if this story resonates with you, please subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who's battling their own thoughts. Leave a comment telling me what your mind has been screaming at you lately. I read every single one, and I pray for each of you. I woke up at 4:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, my heart already racing before my eyes were fully open. The thoughts hit me like a wave the second I became conscious, a torrential flood of worries, fears, and accusations that had become so familiar I almost didn't recognize them as unusual anymore. You're going to lose everything. You're not good enough. Everyone can see you're failing. You're a fraud, and it's only a matter of time before they all know it. Your life is falling apart, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. I lay there in the darkness of my bedroom, the digital clock casting its red glow, and tried to breathe through the panic that was building in my chest. This wasn't new. This had been my reality for the past 6 months. Waking up to a mind that felt like it was at war with itself, thoughts that came so fast and so loud they felt like they were shouting, drowning out everything else. I was 34 years old, a high school English teacher at Lincoln Preparatory Academy, a private school in the suburbs where parents paid premium tuition for their kids to get premium education. I'd been teaching there for 8 years, had good relationships with my students, had won a Teaching Excellence Award just 2 years ago. On paper, my life looked stable, successful even, but inside my head, it was chaos. The thoughts were relentless. They came in waves throughout the day, but they were worst in the early morning hours and late at night when there were no distractions to drown them out. They'd start with one worry, usually something small and manageable, and then spiral into catastrophic scenarios that felt absolutely real in the moment. Did I grade those essays fairly? Became what if I graded them wrong and parents complain? Which became what if they complain to the principal? Which became what if I lose my job? Which became what if I can't find another teaching position? Which became you'll end up homeless and alone and it'll be your own fault for being incompetent. The rational part of my brain, the part that could still sometimes observe what was happening, knew this was anxiety. Knew these thoughts were distortions, not reality, but knowing that intellectually didn't stop them from feeling overwhelmingly true in the moment. It didn't stop the physical symptoms, the racing heart, the tight chest, the shallow breathing, the nausea, the trembling hands. I got out of bed because lying there just made it worse. At least if I was moving, doing something, I could pretend I had some control. I went to the kitchen, made coffee with shaking hands, watched the sun start to rise through my apartment window. The city was waking up. People were starting their normal days. And I was standing in my kitchen at 5 in the morning, trying to talk myself out of a panic attack. The worst part wasn't the anxiety itself. It was the meta-anxiety, the anxiety about having anxiety. The constant monitoring of my own thoughts, waiting for the next wave to hit, wondering if this would be the day I completely fell apart. The fear that I was broken in some fundamental way that couldn't be fixed. I'd been to my doctor 2 months ago. She'd run tests, checked my thyroid, my heart, everything physical, all normal. She'd gently suggested that what I was experiencing was anxiety, possibly panic disorder, and recommended I see a therapist. She'd offered to prescribe something to help in the meantime. I'd taken the prescription but never filled it, because filling it would mean admitting something was really wrong. It would mean accepting that I couldn't handle this on my own. It would mean I was weak, broken, less than. So the paper sat in my wallet, a constant reminder of a help I was too proud or too scared to accept. At school that day, I functioned on autopilot. I taught my classes, British literature to juniors, creative writing to seniors. I graded papers during my planning period. I had lunch duty in the cafeteria, monitoring students, breaking up the occasional conflict. To anyone watching, I probably looked fine. normal, functional, but inside the thoughts never stopped. You're not teaching them anything valuable. That lesson was boring, and they all hated it. You should have explained the symbolism differently. Did you see how confused they looked? You're failing them. You're a terrible teacher and you don't deserve this job. During my last class of the day, while my seniors were working on a writing exercise, I had to excuse myself to the bathroom. I locked myself in a stall and just breathed, trying to calm the panic that was threatening to overwhelm me, right there in the middle of the school day. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the stall walls to steady them. This can't keep happening. You can't fall apart at work. What if someone notices? What if a student needs help and you're having a breakdown in the bathroom? You're pathetic. You're weak. You can't even make it through a normal workday without losing it. I splashed cold water on my face, looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. I looked tired, older than 34. There were dark circles under my eyes from months of poor sleep. My face looked drawn, stressed. When had I started looking like this? After school, I should have gone home, but the thought of being alone in my apartment with just my thoughts felt unbearable. So I drove to a coffee shop, ordered a large black coffee I didn't need, and sat in a corner with my laptop, pretending to work on lesson plans while actually just staring at the screen. The noise of the coffee shop helped. The hum of conversation, the hiss of the espresso machine, the indie music playing overhead, it all created a buffer against my own thoughts. As long as there was external noise, the internal noise felt less overwhelming. My phone buzzed. A text from my older sister, Rachel. "Haven't heard from you in a week. Everything okay?" I typed back, "Yeah, just busy with school stuff. I'm fine." I wasn't fine. But how do you explain to someone that your own mind has become your enemy? That the thoughts in your head feel like they're screaming at you constantly and you don't know how to make them stop? That you're exhausted from fighting a battle no one else can see? Rachel had always been the stable one, married, 2 kids, worked as a nurse, seemed to have her life together in all the ways I didn't. She loved me, I knew that, but I also knew she wouldn't understand this. Nobody in my family talked about mental health. You just dealt with things, you pushed through. You didn't complain about stress or anxiety because everyone had stress and anxiety. You just handled it. Except I wasn't handling it. I was drowning in it. By the time I left the coffee shop, it was nearly 8 p.m. I'd sat there for 3 hours, accomplishing nothing except avoiding my own apartment. But I couldn't stay there forever. Eventually, I had to go home. My apartment felt empty and too quiet. I turned on the TV immediately, needing the noise. I made dinner, microwaved frozen food because actual cooking felt like too much effort. I tried to grade some papers but couldn't focus. The thoughts kept intruding, pulling my attention away from the task. You're going to fall behind on grading. Students will complain, parents will email, the principal will notice. This is how it starts. Small things you let slip, and then everything falls apart. At 11 p.m., I was exhausted, but knew sleep wouldn't come easily. It never did anymore. I'd lie in bed for hours, mind racing, unable to shut off the constant stream of worries and fears. Some nights, I'd finally fall asleep around 3 or 4 a.m., only to wake up a few hours later and start the whole cycle again. I sat on my couch, TV on, but not really watching, and felt the weight of it all pressing down. 6 months of this. 6 months of my mind feeling like a hostile place to live. 6 months of constant mental noise that I couldn't escape because it was coming from inside my own head. I thought about the prescription in my wallet, about the therapist recommendation I'd never followed up on, about all the ways I was refusing help because accepting help felt like admitting defeat. And then I did something I hadn't done since I was a kid in Sunday school. I prayed. My family had been nominally religious when I was growing up. We'd gone to church most Sundays. I'd been in youth group for a while. I'd even been baptized at 14 because that's what you did, but it had never felt real to me. It had felt like tradition, routine, obligation. God had been an abstract concept, not a present reality. I hadn't prayed in probably 15 years, hadn't thought about God except in passing, hadn't considered that faith might be relevant to my actual life. But sitting there at 11 p.m., desperate and exhausted and out of options, I closed my eyes and spoke into the silence of my apartment. God, I don't know if you're real. I don't know if you're listening. I don't even know if I believe in you. But if you are real, if you are there, I need help. My mind won't stop screaming at me. The thoughts won't stop. I can't sleep. I can't focus. I can't function. I feel like I'm losing my mind and I don't know what to do. If you're real, please help me. Please make it stop. Please give me some peace. I can't do this anymore. I opened my eyes, half expecting nothing. Because why would anything change? Prayer was just talking to yourself, right? Just a psychological comfort mechanism, not an actual conversation with an actual God. But then, in the silence that followed my prayer, I felt something. Not a voice I could hear with my ears, not words spoken aloud. But something deeper than sound, more fundamental than language, a presence, a knowing, a weight that felt different from the weight of anxiety. This felt like substance, like reality, like something solid in the midst of chaos. And with that presence came words, not audible but received, understood in a way that bypassed my rational mind and went straight to something deeper. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing. What was that? Where did that come from? Was I making it up, imagining it because I was desperate? But it hadn't felt like my own thoughts. My own thoughts were chaotic, rapid fire, anxious. This had felt different, calm, steady, clear, like a voice cutting through static. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. I repeated it silently to myself. When your mind screams, and it did scream, constantly, relentlessly. Listen to my voice of peace. What did that mean? What was his voice? How did you hear it? How did you distinguish it from all the other noise? I didn't have answers, but for the first time in 6 months, the mental noise had quieted slightly. Not disappeared. I could still feel the anxiety there, coiled and ready to pounce, but it had backed off. Just a little, just enough for me to breathe. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, just being still, just letting that phrase repeat in my mind. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. Eventually I went to bed, and for the first time in months, I fell asleep without hours of tossing and turning. Not because the anxiety was gone. It wasn't. But because something else had been introduced into the equation. Something that felt bigger than the anxiety. Something that felt like it might actually be able to help. I didn't know what it meant yet. I didn't know how to listen to his voice of peace, or even if what I'd experienced was real. But I knew one thing. I'd been at the end of my rope, and something had met me there. Someone had met me there. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something changing. My name is Thomas. And today I'm going to tell you about the morning I woke up and couldn't silence the screaming in my own mind, and how God spoke a truth that would teach me the difference between the noise of anxiety and the voice of peace. Before we continue, if this story resonates with you, please subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who's battling their own thoughts. Leave a comment telling me what your mind has been screaming at you lately. I read every single one, and I pray for each of you. I woke up at 4:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, my heart already racing before my eyes were fully open. The thoughts hit me like a wave the second I became conscious, a torrential flood of worries, fears, and accusations that had become so familiar, I almost didn't recognize them as unusual anymore. You're going to lose everything. You're not good enough. Everyone can see you're failing. You're a fraud, and it's only a matter of time before they all know it. Your life is falling apart, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. I lay there in the darkness of my bedroom, the digital clock casting its red glow, and tried to breathe through the panic that was building in my chest. This wasn't new. This had been my reality for the past 6 months. Waking up to a mind that felt like it was at war with itself, thoughts that came so fast and so loud they felt like they were shouting, drowning out everything else. I was 34 years old. a high school English teacher at Lincoln Preparatory Academy, a private school in the suburbs where parents paid premium tuition for their kids to get premium education. I'd been teaching there for 8 years, had good relationships with my students, had won a Teaching Excellence Award just 2 years ago. On paper, my life looked stable, successful even, but inside my head, it was chaos. The thoughts were relentless. They came in waves throughout the day, but they were worst in the early morning hours and late at night when there were no distractions to drown them out. They'd start with one worry, usually something small and manageable, and then spiral into catastrophic scenarios that felt absolutely real in the moment. Did I grade those essays fairly? Became what if I graded them wrong and parents complain? Which became what if they complain to the principal? Which became what if I lose my job? Which became what if I can't find another teaching position? Which became you'll end up homeless and alone and it'll be your own fault for being incompetent. The rational part of my brain, the part that could still sometimes observe what was happening, knew this was anxiety, knew these thoughts were distortions, not reality. But knowing that intellectually didn't stop them from feeling overwhelmingly true in the moment. It didn't stop the physical symptoms, the racing heart, the tight chest, the shallow breathing, the nausea, the trembling hands. I got out of bed because lying there just made it worse. At least if I was moving, doing something, I could pretend I had some control. I went to the kitchen, made coffee with shaking hands, watched the sun start to rise through my apartment window. The city was waking up. People were starting their normal days. And I was standing in my kitchen at 5 in the morning, trying to talk myself out of a panic attack. The worst part wasn't the anxiety itself. It was the meta-anxiety. The anxiety about having anxiety. The constant monitoring of my own thoughts, waiting for the next wave to hit, wondering if this would be the day I completely fell apart. The fear that I was broken in some fundamental way that couldn't be fixed. I'd been to my doctor 2 months ago. She'd run tests, checked my thyroid, my heart, everything physical, all normal. She'd gently suggested that what I was experiencing was anxiety, possibly panic disorder, and recommended I see a therapist. She'd offered to prescribe something to help in the meantime. I'd taken the prescription but never filled it, because filling it would mean admitting something was really wrong. It would mean accepting that I couldn't handle this on my own. It would mean I was weak, broken, less than. So the paper sat in my wallet, a constant reminder of a help I was too proud or too scared to accept. At school that day, I functioned on autopilot. I taught my classes, British literature to juniors, creative writing to seniors. I graded papers during my planning period. I had lunch duty in the cafeteria, monitoring students, breaking up the occasional conflict. To anyone watching, I probably looked fine, normal, functional, but inside the thoughts never stopped. You're not teaching them anything valuable. That lesson was boring, and they all hated it. You should have explained the symbolism differently. Did you see how confused they looked? You're failing them. You're a terrible teacher and you don't deserve this job. During my last class of the day, while my seniors were working on a writing exercise, I had to excuse myself to the bathroom. I locked myself in a stall and just breathed, trying to calm the panic that was threatening to overwhelm me, right there in the middle of the school day. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the stall walls to steady them. This can't keep happening. You can't fall apart at work. What if someone notices? What if a student needs help and you're having a breakdown in the bathroom? You're pathetic. You're weak. You can't even make it through a normal workday without losing it. I splashed cold water on my face, looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. I looked tired, older than 34. There were dark circles under my eyes from months of poor sleep. My face looked drawn, stressed. When had I started looking like this? After school, I should have gone home, but the thought of being alone in my apartment with just my thoughts felt unbearable. So I drove to a coffee shop, ordered a large black coffee I didn't need, and sat in a corner with my laptop, pretending to work on lesson plans while actually just staring at the screen. The noise of the coffee shop helped. The hum of conversation, the hiss of the espresso machine, the indie music playing overhead, it all created a buffer against my own thoughts. As long as there was external noise, the internal noise felt less overwhelming. My phone buzzed. A text from my older sister, Rachel. "Haven't heard from you in a week. Everything okay?" I typed back, "Yeah, just busy with school stuff. I'm fine." I wasn't fine. But how do you explain to someone that your own mind has become your enemy? That the thoughts in your head feel like they're screaming at you constantly and you don't know how to make them stop? That you're exhausted from fighting a battle no one else can see? Rachel had always been the stable one, married, 2 kids, worked as a nurse, seemed to have her life together in all the ways I didn't. She loved me, I knew that, but I also knew she wouldn't understand this. Nobody in my family talked about mental health. You just dealt with things, you pushed through. You didn't complain about stress or anxiety because everyone had stress and anxiety. You just handled it. Except I wasn't handling it. I was drowning in it. By the time I left the coffee shop, it was nearly 8 p.m. I'd sat there for 3 hours, accomplishing nothing except avoiding my own apartment. But I couldn't stay there forever. Eventually, I had to go home. My apartment felt empty and too quiet. I turned on the TV immediately, needing the noise. I made dinner, microwaved frozen food because actual cooking felt like too much effort. I tried to grade some papers but couldn't focus. The thoughts kept intruding, pulling my attention away from the task. You're going to fall behind on grading. Students will complain, parents will email, the principal will notice. This is how it starts. Small things you let slip, and then everything falls apart. At 11 p.m., I was exhausted, but knew sleep wouldn't come easily. It never did anymore. I'd lie in bed for hours, mind racing, unable to shut off the constant stream of worries and fears. Some nights, I'd finally fall asleep around 3 or 4 a.m., only to wake up a few hours later and start the whole cycle again. I sat on my couch, TV on, but not really watching, and felt the weight of it all pressing down. 6 months of this. 6 months of my mind feeling like a hostile place to live. 6 months of constant mental noise that I couldn't escape because it was coming from inside my own head. I thought about the prescription in my wallet, about the therapist recommendation I'd never followed up on, about all the ways I was refusing help because accepting help felt like admitting defeat. And then I did something I hadn't done since I was a kid in Sunday school. I prayed. My family had been nominally religious when I was growing up. We'd gone to church most Sundays. I'd been in youth group for a while. I'd even been baptized at 14 because that's what you did. But it had never felt real to me. It had felt like tradition, routine, obligation. God had been an abstract concept, not a present reality. I hadn't prayed in probably 15 years, hadn't thought about God except in passing, hadn't considered that faith might be relevant to my actual life. But sitting there at 11 p.m., desperate and exhausted and out of options, I closed my eyes and spoke into the silence of my apartment. God, I don't know if you're real. I don't know if you're listening. I don't even know if I believe in you. But if you are real, if you are there, I need help. My mind won't stop screaming at me. The thoughts won't stop. I can't sleep. I can't focus. I can't function. I feel like I'm losing my mind and I don't know what to do. If you're real, please help me. Please make it stop. Please give me some peace. I can't do this anymore. I opened my eyes, half expecting nothing. Because why would anything change? Prayer was just talking to yourself, right? Just a psychological comfort mechanism, not an actual conversation with an actual God. But then, in the silence that followed my prayer, I felt something. Not a voice I could hear with my ears, not words spoken aloud, but something deeper than sound, more fundamental than language, a presence, a knowing, a weight that felt different from the weight of anxiety. This felt like substance, like reality, like something solid in the midst of chaos. And with that presence came words, not audible but received, understood in a way that bypassed my rational mind and went straight to something deeper. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing. What was that? Where did that come from? Was I making it up, imagining it because I was desperate? But it hadn't felt like my own thoughts. My own thoughts were chaotic, rapid fire, anxious. This had felt different, calm, steady, clear, like a voice cutting through static. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. I repeated it silently to myself. When your mind screams, and it did scream, constantly, relentlessly. Listen to my voice of peace. What did that mean? What was his voice? How did you hear it? How did you distinguish it from all the other noise? I didn't have answers, but for the first time in 6 months, the mental noise had quieted slightly. Not disappeared. I could still feel the anxiety there, coiled and ready to pounce, but it had backed off, just a little, just enough for me to breathe. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, just being still, just letting that phrase repeat in my mind. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. Eventually I went to bed, and for the first time in months, I fell asleep without hours of tossing and turning. Not because the anxiety was gone, it wasn't, but because something else had been introduced into the equation, something that felt bigger than the anxiety, something that felt like it might actually be able to help. I didn't know what it meant yet. I didn't know how to listen to his voice of peace, or even if what I'd experienced was real. But I knew one thing: I'd been at the end of my rope, and something had met me there. Someone had met me there. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something changing. The therapist called back Thursday afternoon during my planning period. Her name was Dr. Patricia Warren, and her voice on the phone was warm and professional. She had an opening the following Tuesday at 4 p.m. Would that work? My immediate reaction was the familiar surge of anxiety. That's right after school. You'll be exhausted. What if you don't say the right things? What if she thinks you're beyond help? What if this doesn't work? But underneath the screaming, I heard it. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. Yes, I said. Tuesday at 4 works. Thank you. After I hung up, I sat at my desk for a moment, processing. I'd done it. I'd made the appointment. In 5 days, I'd be sitting in a therapist's office, talking about my anxiety, getting professional help. The thought was both terrifying and relieving. Friday brought the meeting with Tyler and his parents about the plagiarism. I'd been dreading it all week, the anxious thoughts building elaborate scenarios of angry parents, accusations of unfairness, threats to complain to the principal. Tyler's mom and dad arrived at 3:30, serious but not hostile. We sat in my classroom, me, Tyler, his parents, and Mrs. Chen, the department head. I presented the evidence. The essay, the plagiarism report showing 87% matched content, the citation of sources Tyler had never actually consulted. Tyler was quiet, looking at his hands. His mom asked him directly, "Did you copy this essay from the internet?" He nodded, tears starting. I was overwhelmed. I had 3 other assignments due the same week, and I panicked. I know it was wrong. I'm sorry. His dad, rather than getting defensive, looked at his son with disappointment but also compassion. You made a bad choice. You have to face the consequences, but we'll work through this. They were reasonable, understanding. They didn't attack me or question my integrity. They addressed the situation with their son, accepted the 0 on the assignment, and committed to making sure Tyler understood the seriousness of academic dishonesty. After they left, Mrs. Chen said, "You handled that really well, Thomas. I know these conversations aren't easy." I realized something. The situation I'd been catastrophizing about for days had actually been manageable. Uncomfortable, yes, but not the disaster my mind had predicted. The screaming had been wrong. That evening I went to Riverside Fellowship again. They had regular Friday evening services in addition to Sundays and Wednesdays. I was starting to crave the community, the teaching, the reminder that I wasn't alone in my struggles. Pastor David was teaching again, this time from Philippians 4. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. The peace of God transcends understanding, Pastor David emphasized. That means it doesn't make logical sense. You can have circumstances that are objectively difficult, stressful, uncertain, and still have peace, because God's peace isn't dependent on your circumstances. It's dependent on His presence. After the service, a guy about my age approached me. He was tall, athletic-looking with an easy smile. "Hey, I'm Marcus. I've seen you here a couple times this week. Are you new?" "Yeah, pretty new. I'm Thomas." "Cool. Want to grab coffee after this? There's a group of us who usually hang out at the cafe next door." The screaming started immediately. "You'll have to make small talk. You won't know what to say. They'll ask questions you don't want to answer. It'll be awkward. Just say no and go home." But I'd been learning to recognize that voice for what it was. Fear disguised as wisdom. "Sure," I said. "That sounds good." 6 of us ended up at the cafe. Marcus, his wife Elena, a couple named Josh and Amy, and 2 other guys, Chris and Dev. They were all around my age, mid-30s, various life stages and professions. They made me feel immediately welcome, asking about me, but not in an intrusive way. "So what brought you to Riverside?" Eleanor asked. I hesitated, then decided to risk honesty. "I've been dealing with pretty severe anxiety, for the first time in my life, really. And I was desperate enough to pray, which I haven't done since I was a teenager, and I felt like God answered. So I'm here trying to figure out what that means." "That's brave," Marcus said. "Anxiety is brutal. I dealt with it for years before I learned to manage it. It's what actually brought me to faith originally." "Really?" "Yeah. I was having full-blown panic attacks, thought I was dying. Ended up in the ER twice thinking I was having a heart attack. Finally got diagnosed with panic disorder, started therapy and medication. But it was at church that I learned spiritual tools for managing the mental battle. Both things together, professional help and faith, that's what made the difference." "Did the anxiety go away completely?" "No. I still have anxious moments, but it doesn't control my life anymore. I learned to recognize anxious thoughts for what they are, just thoughts, not truth. And I learned to replace those thoughts with truth from God's Word, instead of just trying to suppress them." Dev, who'd been quiet, spoke up. "I struggle with intrusive thoughts, like really disturbing ones that just pop into my head and make me feel like I'm going crazy. Therapy helped me understand that having a thought doesn't make it true, doesn't mean I want that thing. My brain just generates weird content sometimes." "How do you handle it?" I asked. "I acknowledge the thought without engaging it, like, okay, that's an anxious thought, and then I redirect to something true, usually scripture or something I've memorized about God's character. It's not perfect, but it's better than spiraling." We talked for 2 hours. About mental health, about faith, about the struggle of taking thoughts captive when your thoughts feel overwhelming, about medication, therapy, prayer, community, about the shame that often surrounds mental health struggles, especially in Christian contexts where people sometimes act like faith should eliminate all psychological struggles. "Depression and anxiety aren't signs of weak faith," Amy said firmly. "They're signs of being human in a broken world." Jesus had compassion for people who were suffering mentally and emotionally. He didn't tell them to just have more faith. When I finally left, I had 3 new phone numbers and an invitation to a men's group that Marcus led on Saturday mornings. For the first time in months, I felt less alone. Saturday, I woke up without the immediate assault of anxious thoughts. They came later, of course, they always did. But there was a moment of peace first, a moment where I could just be awake without immediately being at war with my own mind. I went to the men's group at Marcus's house. 6 guys total, sitting in his living room with coffee and bagels, talking about a book they were reading about spiritual formation. The conversation was honest, vulnerable in ways I wasn't used to with other men. One guy, Steve, talked about his struggle with anger. Another, Paul, shared about his marriage difficulties. Chris mentioned his ongoing battle with depression. none of them pretended to have it all together. They were just honest about their struggles and honest about their dependence on God. When it came around to me, I shared about the anxiety, about the 6 months of mental torture, about the moment God had spoken to me. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. That's powerful, Marcus said, because the screaming doesn't stop immediately. You don't just hear God once and suddenly have perfect peace forever. It's a daily practice of choosing which voice to listen to. How do you actually do that? I asked. In the moment when the thoughts are overwhelming, how do you distinguish between your anxious thoughts and God's voice? God's voice always aligns with his character, Marcus said. He's not a God of confusion or fear or condemnation. So when you hear thoughts that are full of shame, hopelessness, fear, that's not God. When you hear thoughts that are true, hopeful, grace-filled, that call you higher but don't condemn you, that's more likely to be God's voice. What about when the anxious thoughts seem logical? I asked. Like they're pointing out real problems or real possibilities. That's trickier, Paul admitted, because sometimes anxiety latches onto real concerns and amplifies them out of proportion. I think you have to ask, is this thought leading me toward wisdom and action, or is it leading me toward paralysis and panic? God's voice might point out a real issue, but it'll do so in a way that empowers you to address it, not in a way that makes you feel helpless. After the group, Marcus and I talked one-on-one while he cleaned up. You mentioned you have a therapy appointment Tuesday, he said. That's good, really good, but I also want to give you something. He went to his bookshelf and pulled out a small book. This is a devotional about taking thoughts captive. It's specifically written for people dealing with anxiety. It helped me a lot when I was in the thick of it. Each day has a scripture, a short reflection, and a practical exercise. You might find it useful. I took the book feeling unexpected emotion. A week ago, I'd been isolated, convinced I was the only one dealing with this, too ashamed to tell anyone. Now I had people who understood, who'd walked this road, who were willing to help. Sunday, I went to Riverside's main service. The sanctuary was fuller than it had been on Wednesday or Friday, probably 500 people. The energy was different too, more celebratory, more families with kids. Pastor David's message was about the armor of God from Ephesians 6. When he got to the helmet of salvation, he paused. The helmet protects your head, your mind, your thoughts. And Paul says it's the helmet of salvation. Why? Because our minds are a battlefield. The enemy's primary strategy is to attack our thoughts, to make us doubt God's love, doubt our worth, doubt truth itself. And our protection is remembering who we are in Christ, remembering that we're saved, loved, chosen, secure. When the thoughts come, and they will come, we have to consciously put on the helmet, remind ourselves of truth. After the service, I was standing in the lobby trying to decide whether to go to the coffee bar or just head home, when Susan, the woman who'd prayed for me on Wednesday, came up to me. "Thomas, right? How are you doing?" "Better, actually. I've been coming to multiple services, met some people, joined a men's group. It's been really helpful." She smiled. "I'm so glad. God was really clear that you needed community, not just individual prayer. We're not meant to fight these battles alone." Can I ask you something?" I said. "How do you know when it's actually God speaking versus just your own thoughts or wishes?" "That's a question everyone asks," she said. "And honestly, it takes time and practice to learn to recognize his voice. But here's what I've learned. God's voice brings life. Even when it's correcting you or challenging you, there's life in it. The enemy's voice, or just our own anxious thoughts, those bring death, fear, shame, hopelessness, paralysis. John 10:10 says the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. But Jesus came that we might have life abundantly. So ask yourself, is this thought leading me toward life or toward death? That's often a good indicator. That afternoon, I started reading the devotional Marcus had given me. The first entry was about Romans 12:2. "Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." The reflection talked about how transformation happens through mind renewal, literally changing the patterns of thinking we've developed. It explained that neural pathways in our brains get stronger the more we use them, which is why anxious thoughts can feel automatic and overwhelming. But we can create new pathways through intentional practice of different thoughts. The practical exercise was simple. Identify one recurring anxious thought. Write down the evidence for and against it. Then write a more balanced, truthful thought to replace it. I picked one of my most persistent thoughts. I'm going to lose my job because I'm not good enough at teaching. Evidence for, sometimes I feel unprepared. Students don't always engage. I've made mistakes. Evidence against, I've been teaching for 8 years without any negative reviews. I won an Excellence Award 2 years ago. Students generally do well in my classes. The plagiarism situation was handled professionally. My annual evaluations have all been positive. More balanced thought. I'm a competent teacher who, like everyone, has strengths and weaknesses. Some days are better than others, but overall, I'm doing good work. It seemed almost too simple, but writing it out, seeing it in black and white, made something shift. The catastrophic version, I'm going to lose my job, was based on feelings, not facts. The balanced version acknowledged reality more accurately. Monday at school, I had my first real test of what I'd been learning. The principal, Dr. Matthews, called me into her office during my planning period. My immediate reaction was pure panic. This is it. Someone complained. You're in trouble. You're going to lose your job. But I caught the thought, recognized it as the screaming, and chose to listen to something else. You don't know why she wants to talk to you. Don't catastrophize before you have information. I walked to Dr. Matthews' office, heart pounding but not spiraling. She gestured for me to sit. Thomas, I wanted to talk to you about the plagiarism situation with Tyler Morrison. My stomach dropped. Here it comes. His parents called me, she continued. They wanted me to know how professionally you handled the situation. They were impressed that you followed protocol, presented clear evidence, and treated their son with respect, even while holding him accountable. They specifically asked me to commend you for your integrity. I stared at her. They called to commend me. Yes, and I agree with them. You handled a difficult situation exactly right. I wanted you to know that I appreciate having teachers on staff who take academic integrity seriously. Good work, Thomas. I walked out of her office in a daze. The thing I'd been catastrophizing about, the thing my mind had been screaming would destroy my career, had actually resulted in commendation. The screaming had been completely wrong. That night, I wrote in a journal I'd started keeping, I'm learning that my anxious thoughts are not prophecies. They're not premonitions. They're not truth. They're just thoughts generated by an anxious brain. And I don't have to believe them. I can acknowledge them, there's an anxious thought, and then choose to focus on what's actually true, on what God says, instead of what fear says. Tomorrow was Tuesday, my first therapy appointment. I was nervous about it, but I was going, because I was learning that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's taking action despite the fear. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. The mind was still screaming sometimes, but I was getting better at hearing the other voice, the quieter voice, the voice that told the truth, the voice of peace. Tuesday afternoon, I left school at 3:30 and drove to Dr. Warren's office. The whole drive, my mind alternated between screaming and that quieter voice of peace. Screaming, you're going to have to explain everything that's wrong with you. She's going to think you're broken. This is a waste of time and money. You should just cancel and handle this yourself. Peace, you're doing something brave. Getting help is wisdom, not weakness. You don't have to have all the answers today. Dr. Warren's office was in a professional building near downtown. The waiting room was small, comfortable, with soft lighting and instrumental music playing quietly. I filled out intake paperwork, medical history, current symptoms, what I hoped to get from therapy. My hand shook slightly as I wrote, but I wrote honestly. At exactly 4 o'clock, a woman in her mid-50s opened the door. She had short grey hair, kind eyes, and an immediately calming presence. Thomas, I'm Dr. Warren. Come on in. Her office was warm, inviting. Bookshelves lined with therapy texts and novels, a couch and two armchairs arranged around a small table, natural light from a large window, nothing clinical or intimidating about it. "So," she said once we were settled, "tell me what brings you here." I took a breath. "I've been dealing with severe anxiety for about 6 months. Racing thoughts, panic attacks, insomnia. It's affecting my work, my life, everything. I've been trying to handle it on my own, but it's not working." "Can you tell me what the thoughts are typically about?" "Everything. Work mostly. I'm a high school teacher, and my mind constantly tells me I'm doing a terrible job. I'm going to get fired. I'm failing my students. But it spirals into everything else too. Financial fears, health fears, social fears. Once it starts, it just cascades." "How long do these episodes typically last?" "Sometimes minutes, sometimes hours. The really bad ones can last all day. And they're worst in the early morning and at night." "Have you had panic attacks?" "I think so. Heart racing, can't breathe, feeling like I'm dying. Maybe 3 or 4 times in the past 6 months." Dr. Warren took notes, asked more questions about my sleep, my eating, my concentration, about whether I'd experienced trauma or major life changes, about family history of mental health issues. She was thorough but not intrusive, professional but warm. "Based on what you're describing," she said, "it sounds like you're dealing with generalized anxiety disorder, possibly with panic episodes. The good news is that GAD is very treatable. The not-so-good news is that it requires work, both in therapy and in your daily life. This isn't something I can just fix for you, but I can give you tools, and we can work through this together." "What kind of tools?" "We'll use cognitive behavioral therapy primarily. That's a fancy way of saying we'll look at the relationship between your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. You'll learn to identify anxious thought patterns, challenge them, and replace them with more accurate thoughts. We'll also work on anxiety management techniques, breathing exercises, grounding techniques, things that can help in the moment when you're overwhelmed. I've been trying to do some of that on my own, through faith actually, learning to recognize when my thoughts are just anxiety and not truth." "That's excellent," Dr. Warren said. "Faith and therapy work really well together. I'm a person of faith myself, so I understand that perspective. The spiritual practice of taking thoughts captive. That's basically what CBT is, just with some additional psychological framework." And we spent the rest of the session doing what she called baseline work, establishing what my anxiety looked like currently, what triggers I'd identified, what coping mechanisms I already used. She gave me homework: keep a thought log for the week, writing down anxious thoughts when they came, rating their intensity, noting what triggered them. "The act of writing them down helps create distance," she explained. "When the thoughts are just swirling in your head, they feel overwhelming and true. But when you write them down and look at them objectively, you can start to see patterns and distortions." As I left her office, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. Not because the anxiety was gone, it wasn't, but because I'd taken a concrete step toward dealing with it. I had a plan. I had professional help. I wasn't alone in this fight anymore. That evening at the Wednesday service at Riverside, Pastor David taught about the story of Jesus calming the storm. The disciples in a boat, terrified by the wind and waves, thinking they were going to die, and Jesus, asleep in the boat, then waking up to say, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" He spoke to the storm, "Peace, be still," and it obeyed. "Notice something important," Pastor David said. "Jesus didn't rebuke the disciples for being in the storm. He rebuked them for forgetting he was in the boat with them. The storm was real, the danger was real, but so was his presence. And his presence was more powerful than the storm." He let that sink in before continuing. "Some of you are in storms right now, mental storms, emotional storms, circumstantial storms, and you're terrified. You feel like you're drowning. But Jesus is asking you the same question. Do you have faith? Not faith that the storm will immediately stop, though it might, but faith that he's in the boat with you, that his peace is available even in the midst of the storm. After the service, Marcus found me. How was the therapy appointment? Really good, actually. She seems great. Gave me homework and everything. That's awesome, man. Proud of you for going. I know that first appointment is hard. He paused. Hey, some of us are starting a prayer group specifically for people dealing with mental health stuff. Meets Sunday evenings. Interested? Yeah, definitely. Cool. And Thomas, you've been here, what, a week and a half, and you're already plugged into community, seeing a therapist, doing the work. That's not small. That's significant progress. I hadn't thought about it that way. But he was right. 2 weeks ago, I'd been isolated, drowning, convinced I had to handle everything alone. Now I had a church community, a therapist, tools to work with, and people who understood. Things were changing. That night, I started the thought log Dr. Warren had assigned. The first entry came at 11 p.m. when I was trying to fall asleep. Thought, I'm going to have a panic attack tonight and won't be able to sleep. Intensity, 710. Trigger, lying in bed, aware of my heartbeat. Evidence for, I've had trouble sleeping before. My heart is beating faster than normal. Evidence against, my heart often beats faster when I'm anxious, but that doesn't mean I'm having a panic attack. I've slept well the past several nights. I have tools now to manage anxiety. More balanced thought. I'm noticing some anxiety, but that doesn't mean I'll have a panic attack. I can use breathing techniques and focus on truth instead of catastrophizing. Writing it out helped. The thought lost some of its power when I examined it objectively. I did my breathing exercises, 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out, and focused on that phrase. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. I fell asleep within 30 minutes. Thursday and Friday at school were relatively stable. I had my usual anxious moments, worrying about lesson plans, about whether students were learning, about whether I was doing enough. But I caught the thoughts more quickly now. I identified them as anxiety rather than truth, and I redirected. One moment stood out. Friday afternoon, a student named Jasmine stayed after class to talk to me. She was one of my brightest students, always participating, always insightful, but she looked stressed. Mr. Morgan, can I ask you something? Of course. How do you deal with, I don't know how to say this, how do you deal with feeling like your thoughts are out of control, like they won't stop? I looked at her carefully. She was 17, college-bound, probably dealing with academic pressure and all the normal stress of being a teenager. And she was asking me for help with something I was actively struggling with myself. That's a really honest question, Jasmine. And I want to be honest back. I struggle with that too, more than you might think. Her eyes widened slightly. Really? But you always seem so calm and organized. That's what people see. But inside, my mind races a lot. I deal with anxiety, and I'm learning that having racing thoughts doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It just means your brain is trying to process a lot. And sometimes, it goes into overdrive. What helps you? I thought about the past 2 weeks. About everything I'd been learning. A few things. 1, I write down the thoughts instead of just letting them swirl. That helps me see them more objectively. 2, I try to identify which thoughts are based on facts and which are just fear. 3, I've started going to therapy to learn better coping strategies. And 4, I pray. I have faith that helps ground me when everything feels chaotic. Do you think I should talk to someone, like a counselor? I think if your thoughts are overwhelming and affecting your life, yes. There's no shame in getting help. It's actually really brave. She nodded, looking relieved. Thank you for being honest with me. It helps to know I'm not the only one. After she left, I sat at my desk for a moment, processing. A month ago, I would have hidden my struggle, pretended I had it all together, felt ashamed that a student could see any weakness. But I'd just been honest about my anxiety with a student, and it had helped her feel less alone. Maybe my struggle had purpose. Maybe my pain could help someone else. That weekend, I went to Marcus's men's group on Saturday and the new prayer group on Sunday evening. The prayer group was small, maybe 10 people, mixed ages and backgrounds, all dealing with various mental health challenges: depression, anxiety, OCD, PTSD, bipolar disorder. We shared our struggles without judgment, prayed for each other, reminded each other that mental illness didn't disqualify us from God's love. One woman, Linda, probably in her 60s, shared about her lifelong battle with depression. "I've been on medication for 30 years, she said, "and I've been a Christian for 40 years. Some people have told me that if I just had enough faith, I wouldn't need medication. But you know what? God gave us medication. God gave us brain chemistry that can be helped with medicine. Taking my antidepressant doesn't mean I lack faith. It means I'm being a good steward of the body and mind God gave me." Her words resonated with me. I'd been hesitant about medication, worried it meant I was weak or faithless. But what if it was just another tool, like therapy, like prayer, like community? What if God worked through medicine too? At my second therapy appointment on Tuesday, I brought up the medication question with Dr. Warren. "I think it could be helpful," she said. "You're doing good work with the cognitive techniques, and you're building good support systems. But your brain chemistry might benefit from some additional support. It's not either or, therapy or medication. Often they work best together." I've been resistant to it, felt like it meant I was failing somehow. That's a common feeling. But would you feel like you were failing if you had diabetes and took insulin? Or if you had high blood pressure and took medication for that? No, of course not. Then why is brain chemistry different? Your brain is an organ just like your pancreas or your heart. Sometimes it needs help functioning optimally. That's not a moral failure, it's just medical reality. Darigi, we talked through the options. She recommended I see a psychiatrist for a proper evaluation and prescription, but she could refer me to someone good. In the meantime, we worked on more CBT techniques, specifically something called cognitive distortions. "Your brain has developed habitual ways of thinking that aren't accurate," Dr. Warren explained. "Things like catastrophizing, assuming the worst possible outcome, or all-or-nothing thinking, believing that if something isn't perfect, it's a complete failure, or mind-reading, assuming you know what others are thinking about you. These distortions fuel anxiety, but once you learn to recognize them, you can challenge them." She gave me a handout listing common cognitive distortions. As I read through them, I recognized patterns I engaged in constantly. Catastrophizing. If I make one mistake, I'll lose my job and my life will fall apart. All-or-nothing thinking. If I'm not a perfect teacher, I'm a terrible teacher. Mind reading. My students think I'm boring and they don't respect me. Fortune telling. I know I'm going to have a panic attack tonight. Emotional reasoning. I feel like a failure, therefore I am a failure. Your homework this week, Dr. Warren said, is to identify the distortions when they show up. Name them. Don't just write down the thought. Write down which distortion it is. That creates even more distance and helps you see that these are patterns, not truth. Over the next few days, I practiced obsessively. Every anxious thought I examined. Is this catastrophizing? Is this mind-reading? Is this all-or-nothing thinking? And almost always, I could identify a distortion. My anxious brain wasn't telling me truth. It was telling me distorted versions of reality. Friday evening, I was at home grading papers when my phone rang. It was Rachel. "Hey, Thomas. How are you doing?" "Actually, pretty good. I've been in therapy for 2 weeks now. It's helping a lot." "That's wonderful. I'm so glad you're getting help. How are the kids?" "They're good. Lily's been asking about Uncle Thomas. She wants to know when you're coming to visit." Guilt hit immediately. I hadn't seen my niece and nephew in months. I'd been avoiding family gatherings because the anxiety made them feel overwhelming. "I know. I'm sorry I've been absent." "Don't apologize. I understand. But maybe when you're feeling up to it, you could come for dinner. Nothing big, just the 5 of us." The thought made me anxious, but I caught it. This is anticipatory anxiety. It might be uncomfortable, but you can handle it. You have tools now. "Yeah, I'd like that. Next weekend?" "Perfect. I'll text you details." After we hung up, I wrote in my thought log. Thought, family dinner will be overwhelming and I'll fall apart in front of them. Distortion, catastrophizing, fortune-telling evidence against, I've been managing anxiety better. I have tools now. Rachel understands what I'm going through. Even if I feel anxious, that doesn't mean I'll fall apart. More balanced thought, I might feel some anxiety at dinner, but I can manage it. It's important to maintain relationships with family, and this is a safe environment to practice. That night, before bed, I read in the devotional Marcus had given me. The entry was about Philippians 4:8. Whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. The reflection said, this isn't toxic positivity or pretending problems don't exist. It's about intentionally directing your attention. Your brain will naturally gravitate toward threats and problems. That's how it's wired for survival. But you can train it to also notice truth, beauty, goodness, not instead of acknowledging difficulty, but alongside it. The exercise was to list 5 true good things from the day. I wrote, I had a meaningful conversation with a student who needed support. My second therapy session gave me helpful new tools. I scheduled dinner with Rachel and the kids. I slept well last night. The sun was shining today, and the weather was beautiful. Small things, but real things, true things. And as I wrote them, I realized my brain had been so focused on problems and fears that I'd stopped noticing the good. I'd stopped noticing evidence that life wasn't only terrible, that I wasn't only struggling, that there was beauty alongside the difficulty. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. The screaming was still there. The anxiety hadn't vanished, but I was learning to hear another voice, a voice that spoke truth instead of distortion, a voice that reminded me I wasn't alone, a voice that offered peace even in the midst of the storm, and slowly, day by day, that voice was getting stronger. The dinner at Rachel's house was scheduled for Saturday evening. All week, I felt the anticipatory anxiety building, that particular flavor of fear about a future event that my mind wanted to catastrophize into disaster. But I had tools now. Every time the thoughts started spiraling, you're going to be awkward, they'll see how anxious you are, you'll ruin the evening, I caught them, named the distortion, fortune-telling, catastrophizing, wrote them in my log, challenged them with evidence, replaced them with more balanced thoughts. Friday after school, I met with the psychiatrist Dr. Warren had referred me to. Dr. Patel was probably in his 40s, had a calm, straightforward manner that I appreciated. We talked for an hour about my symptoms, my history, what I'd tried so far. I think medication would be beneficial, he said, not as a replacement for the therapy work you're doing, but as support. Think of it like this. Right now, your brain chemistry is making it harder for you to use the coping tools you're learning. Medication can help level the playing field so the tools actually work. He prescribed an SSRI, a low dose to start, with the plan to adjust if needed. It takes a few weeks to build up in your system, he explained. You might not notice changes immediately, and there can be some side effects initially, nausea, headaches, changes in sleep, but they usually pass within the first couple weeks. I picked up the prescription on my way home, stood in my kitchen, looking at the bottle, feeling that familiar resistance. This means you're really broken. This means you couldn't fix it yourself. This means you're weak. But then I remembered Linda from the prayer group. God gave us medication. Taking my antidepressant doesn't mean I lack faith. And Dr. Warren, your brain is an organ. Sometimes it needs help functioning optimally. I took the first pill with dinner. One small step, one choice to accept help, instead of insisting on handling everything alone. Saturday morning, Marcus's men's group was discussing a chapter about spiritual warfare. The book talked about how the enemy's primary strategy is deception, getting us to believe lies about ourselves, about God, about reality. That's what anxiety does, Steve said. It's a form of deception. It tells you lies that feel true. It convinces you that catastrophes are inevitable when they're just possible. But how do you fight something that's happening inside your own mind? Paul asked. With external problems, you can take action. But with mental battles, it feels like you're fighting yourself. That's why Scripture talks about the armor of God, Marcus said, because some battles can't be fought with human effort alone. We need spiritual resources, truth to counter lies, faith to counter fear, God's peace to counter anxiety. Chris, who'd been quiet, spoke up. I think it's both and, not either or. I need my medication for depression. I need therapy to learn coping skills. But I also need prayer, scripture, community, faith, all of it working together. The medical stuff addresses the biological component. The spiritual stuff addresses the soul component. Both are real, both matter. That evening, I drove to Rachel's house. The closer I got, the louder the screaming became. Turn around. You don't have to do this. You're going to be miserable. They'll see through you. This was a mistake. But I kept driving, and I talked back to the thoughts. These are just thoughts. They're not truth. I'm feeling anxious, but I can handle anxious feelings. Rachel loves me and wants to see me. This is important. When Rachel opened the door, her face lit up. Thomas, come in, come in. She hugged me, and I realized how much I'd missed her, how much I'd isolated myself over the past 6 months. Her kids, Lily, age 7, and Ethan, age 4, came running. Uncle Thomas! Lily wrapped her arms around my waist. Ethan, more shy, hung back but smiled. Rachel's husband Josh was in the kitchen, making his signature lasagna. The house smelled amazing. Everything felt normal, comfortable, safe. We ate dinner around their dining room table, and it was fine, better than fine. The kids chatted about school and friends and their latest obsessions. Rachel and Josh asked about my teaching, genuinely interested. Nobody pressed me about why I'd been absent. Nobody made me feel guilty or interrogated me about my mental health. After dinner, while the kids played in the living room, Rachel and I talked in the kitchen while cleaning up. You seem different, she said. Better, less tense than the last time I saw you. I'm working on it. Therapy, medication now, church community, prayer. Learning to manage the anxiety instead of just being overwhelmed by it. I'm proud of you, really proud. It's not easy to admit you need help and actually get it. I had a moment with one of my students this week, I said. She asked me how I deal with racing thoughts, and I was honest with her about my own struggle. Told her I deal with anxiety, that I'm in therapy. And instead of her losing respect for me, she said it helped her feel less alone. Rachel smiled. That's the thing about vulnerability. When we're honest about our struggles, we give others permission to be honest about theirs. You're being a better teacher by admitting you don't have it all together than you ever were by pretending you did. On the drive home, I felt something unexpected. Gratitude. The evening I'd been dreading had actually been life-giving. I'd connected with family. I'd been present instead of anxious. I'd proven to myself that I could do hard things. Sunday at church, Pastor David's message was about the peace that transcends understanding from Philippians 4. This peace doesn't make logical sense, he said. You can have circumstances that are objectively stressful, difficult, uncertain, and still have peace. Because God's peace isn't dependent on your circumstances being perfect, it's dependent on His presence being real. After the service, Susan found me. Thomas, how are you doing? I've been praying for you. Better, a lot better actually. I'm in therapy now, started medication, building community here. Learning to distinguish between my anxious thoughts and God's voice. That's wonderful. Can I share something with you? When you first came and asked for prayer, God gave me a picture. I saw you standing in a storm, but there was a shelter, like a safe room, in the middle of it. And God was inviting you into that shelter. I think that's what you've been doing these past few weeks. Learning to run to Him when the storm of anxiety hits, instead of trying to weather it alone. Her words made my throat tight with emotion. That's exactly what it's been like, learning that I don't have to fight the battles alone, that there's a safe place in the midst of chaos. That week in therapy, Dr. Warren introduced a new concept, Anxiety as information. Anxiety isn't just random, she explained. It's your brain's attempt to protect you from perceived threats. The problem is your brain's threat detection system is overactive. It's seeing danger where there isn't any real danger. But if you can learn to treat anxiety as information rather than truth, you can ask, what is my brain trying to protect me from? And is that protection actually necessary? We practiced with one of my recurring thoughts. I'm going to lose my job. What would losing your job mean to you? She asked. Financial insecurity, shame, feeling like a failure, not knowing what to do next. Okay, so your brain is trying to protect you from those things. That makes sense. They're uncomfortable. But is the threat real? Are you actually in danger of losing your job? No, objectively no. I have good reviews. Students do well in my classes. The principal just commended me. There's no actual evidence I'm going to lose my job. So your anxiety is giving you false information. It's like a smoke alarm going off when you're making toast. The alarm is working as designed, but there's no actual fire. The question becomes, how do you turn off the alarm without unplugging it completely? How do you do that? You acknowledge it? Okay, I'm feeling anxious about my job, and then you reality test it. What's the actual evidence? What's most likely true? And then you take appropriate action. If there were a real problem with your job performance, appropriate action would be addressing it. But if there's no real problem, appropriate action is redirecting your attention to something productive. This framework helped immensely. Anxiety wasn't the enemy. It was just information, sometimes accurate, often not. My job was to evaluate the information rather than just believing it automatically. The medication was starting to work, I thought. Or maybe it was the therapy, or the community, or the prayer, probably all of it together. But something was shifting. The baseline anxiety, that constant hum of unease, was quieter. The spirals happened less frequently. When they did happen, I recovered faster. I still had hard moments. Wednesday night I woke at 2 a.m. with my heart pounding, thoughts racing, convinced something terrible was about to happen. I couldn't even identify what I was afraid of, just a nameless dread that felt overwhelming. I got up, went to my living room, turned on a single lamp, and I prayed. God, I don't know what I'm afraid of right now, but I'm afraid. And I know you're with me even when I feel alone. Help me hear your voice above the screaming. I sat in silence, breathing, waiting, and slowly I felt it. That presence, that peace that didn't make logical sense. The screaming was still there, but something else was there too, something bigger than the fear. A thought came, clear and gentle. You're safe. Right now, in this moment, you're safe. Nothing bad is happening. You're in your home, you're breathing, you're okay. I repeated it like a mantra. I'm safe, I'm breathing, I'm okay. Right now, in this moment, I'm okay. The panic subsided, not instantly, but gradually. Within 20 minutes, I was calm enough to go back to bed. I slept until morning. Thursday at school, I had a breakthrough with my creative writing class. We'd been working on personal narrative essays, and I'd assigned them to write about a challenge they'd overcome. Most students wrote about sports losses, friendship drama, academic struggles, typical teenage challenges. But one student, Marcus, different from my Marcus at church, turned in an essay about his battle with depression. He wrote about feeling hopeless, about suicidal thoughts, about finally getting help through therapy and medication. He wrote about the shame he felt, the fear that people would think he was weak, the relief of finally being honest. After class, I asked him to stay back. Marcus, I wanted to talk to you about your essay. He looked nervous. Is something wrong? No, it's powerful, really powerful. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share it with the class. I think other students might really benefit from hearing your story. You want me to read it out loud? To the whole class? Only if you're comfortable. But I think there's value in students hearing that depression is real, that getting help is brave, that they're not alone if they're struggling. He thought about it. Can I think about it? Of course. No pressure either way. The next day, Marcus came to me before class. I want to read it. I've been thinking about how isolated I felt when I was going through the worst of it. If sharing my story helps even one person feel less alone, it's worth it. During class, Marcus read his essay. The room was completely silent. When he finished, several students had tears in their eyes. A girl named Emma raised her hand. "Thank you for sharing that. I've been dealing with anxiety, and I felt like I was the only one. It helps to know other people understand." Another student, David, said, "My brother has depression. I didn't really understand it before, but hearing your story helps me understand what he's going through." The conversation that followed was one of the most meaningful I'd experienced as a teacher. Students opened up about their own mental health struggles, about family members who were suffering, about the pressure they felt to be perfect. We talked about the importance of getting help, about resources available, about the fact that struggling didn't make them weak. After class, several students came up to me privately. Two asked for information about counseling services. One thanked me for creating a safe space to talk about hard things. One said, "Mr. Morgan, you seem like you really understand this stuff, like you get it personally, not just academically." I smiled. "I do understand. I've been dealing with severe anxiety myself. I'm in therapy, learning to manage it. So when I say it's okay to struggle, and it's brave to get help, I'm not just saying that. I'm living it." That evening at the prayer group, I shared about what had happened in class. "I think God's using my struggle for something bigger than me," I said. "The anxiety has been awful. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. But it's also given me empathy and understanding that I didn't have before. It's made me a better teacher, a better friend, a more compassionate person." Linda nodded. "That's how God works. He doesn't waste our pain. He redeems it. He uses it for purpose. Your suffering isn't meaningless. It's being transformed into something that helps others." By the end of the week, I'd been on medication for 2 weeks. Dr. Patel had said it would take a few weeks to fully kick in, but I was already noticing changes. The constant edge of panic was softer, the racing thoughts were slower. I was sleeping better, eating better, functioning better. But more than the medication, I think what was helping most was everything together. The therapy giving me tools, the medication supporting my brain chemistry, the community reminding me I wasn't alone, the faith teaching me to trust something bigger than my fear. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. I was getting better at this. Not perfect. I still had moments where the screaming drowned everything else out. But more and more often I could hear both voices, the voice of anxiety and the voice of peace, and I could choose which one to listen to, and I was choosing peace. 3 months had passed since that night I first prayed. 3 months since God had spoken those words that would become my anchor. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. 90 days of learning what that actually meant in practice, of discovering that transformation was a process, not an event. I was sitting in Dr. Warren's office for what had become my weekly ritual. We'd fallen into a comfortable rhythm. She'd ask about my week. I'd share my thought logs. We'd process what had come up. She'd give me new tools or refine old ones. "Tell me about the hard moments this week," she said, settling into her chair with her notepad. "Tuesday was rough. I woke up at 3 a.m. with a full panic attack. Heart racing, can't breathe, convinced I was dying. It had been almost 2 weeks since the last one, so I thought maybe I was past them. What triggered it? I don't know. That's what's frustrating. Nothing specific happened. I just woke up in full panic mode." "And what did you do?" "I got up, went to the living room, did the breathing exercises you taught me. 4 counts in, hold 4, 4 counts out. And I prayed. Reminded myself of what's true, that panic attacks feel like dying, but they're not actually dangerous, that they pass, that I'm safe." "How long did it take to come down?" "Maybe 20 minutes, which is better than it used to be. 6 months ago, a panic attack like that would have lasted hours and sent me spiraling for days. This time I recovered and went back to sleep." Dr. Warren smiled. "That's significant progress, Thomas. You had a panic attack, but you managed it. You used your tools. You didn't catastrophize about having the panic attack, which used to be one of your patterns. Do you see how far you've come?" I did see it when she pointed it out, but in the moment it had just felt like failure, like evidence that I wasn't actually getting better, that I'd always be broken, that the anxiety would never really go away. The thoughts still scream sometimes, I admitted, even with the medication, even with all the tools. Some days the volume is just as loud as it was 3 months ago. But what's different? I thought about it. I guess I don't believe the screaming as automatically as I used to. It's like having a neighbor who yells a lot. At first, you believe everything they're yelling. You think there must be an emergency. Something must be wrong. But after a while, you learn that they just yell. The yelling doesn't mean there's actually danger. That's exactly right. You're developing what we call metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe your thoughts without being controlled by them. The anxiety still shows up, but you're not fused with it anymore. There's some distance. We spent the rest of the session working on what she called anxiety as information rather than anxiety as truth. She explained that my brain's threat detection system was overactive, seeing danger where there wasn't any real danger. But if I could learn to evaluate the information my anxiety was giving me, I could respond appropriately instead of just reacting. When the anxiety screams, "You're going to fail," ask yourself, what would failing look like? What's the actual evidence? What's the worst realistic outcome? And then, what's the most likely outcome? You'll usually find that the anxiety is catastrophizing. After therapy, I went to Riverside for the Wednesday evening service. 3 months in, this community had become essential to my healing. I knew people by name now. They knew my story. I didn't have to pretend or perform. I could just be myself, struggles and all. Pastor David's message was about the persistent widow from Luke 18, the woman who kept pestering the judge until he gave her justice. Sometimes faith looks like persistent asking, he said. Not because God is reluctant to help, but because the persistent asking changes us. It keeps us engaged, keeps us dependent, keeps us believing that God is capable even when we don't see results yet. I thought about my own persistent asking. For 3 months, I'd been praying every day, sometimes multiple times a day. Help me hear your voice of peace above the screaming. And God had been answering. Not by eliminating the screaming, but by teaching me to recognize a different voice, by building my capacity to hear peace, even when panic was loud. After the service, Marcus found me. "Hey man, got time for coffee?" We went to the cafe next door, our usual spot. Marcus ordered his usual oat milk latte, I got black coffee, and we settled into a corner booth. "So, I wanted to talk to you about something," Marcus said. "The church is starting a formalized mental health ministry. Susan's going to lead it, but she's looking for people to help, people who have lived experience and are willing to be vulnerable. I immediately thought of you. My first reaction was the familiar anxiety. I'm not qualified. I'm still struggling myself. What if I mess up and hurt someone? What if people see how broken I really am?" But I caught the thoughts, named them, catastrophizing, all or nothing thinking, mind reading. What would it involve? I asked. Co-facilitating support groups, probably. Sharing your testimony when appropriate. Helping create resources. Basically being a safe person for people who are struggling, because you know what that's like. I'm interested, but I'm also scared. What if my anxiety gets really bad again? What if I have a panic attack in front of people I'm supposed to be helping? Marcus leaned forward. "Thomas, that's exactly what would make you credible. You're not claiming to be healed and perfect. You're honest about the ongoing struggle. That's what people need, someone who gets it because they're living it, not someone who's on the other side looking back." He had a point. My pain had purpose. The very thing I'd been most ashamed of, my mental health struggles, could be used to help others. "Okay," I said, "I'm in. When do we start?" Over the next few weeks, I worked with Susan to develop the mental health ministry. We created support groups for different struggles: anxiety, depression, grief, trauma. We compiled resources, therapists, crisis hotlines, books, podcasts. We trained lay counselors in how to listen well, how to recognize when someone needed professional help, how to support without trying to fix. And we shared our stories. Susan shared about her daughter's suicide attempt and the family's journey through that trauma. Marcus shared about his panic disorder. I shared about my 6 months of mental torture and the ongoing work of managing anxiety. The response was overwhelming. The first support group meeting, we expected maybe 10 people. 40 showed up. People who'd been suffering in silence, convinced they were the only ones, desperate for community and hope. I co-facilitated the anxiety support group with Marcus. That first night, we sat in a circle, 12 people, various ages and backgrounds, all dealing with some form of anxiety disorder. We opened with a simple question: what does your anxiety scream at you? The answers came slowly at first, then faster, as people realized this was a safe space, that I'm going to lose control and everyone will see. That something terrible is about to happen to my kids. That I'm a burden and people would be better off without me. That I'm going crazy and will end up institutionalized. That every physical sensation is a sign of serious illness. As I listened to their screaming, I heard echoes of my own. Different specifics, same underlying fears. Fear of loss, fear of inadequacy, fear of catastrophe, fear of being fundamentally broken. Here's what I've learned, I said when it was my turn to share. The screaming isn't truth. It's anxiety trying to protect you from perceived threats. Your brain means well. It's trying to keep you safe, but it's overreacting. It's like a smoke alarm going off when you're making toast. The alarm is doing what it's designed to do, but there's no actual fire. I told them about the phrase God had given me: when your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. I explained how I'd been learning to distinguish between the two voices, one that brought fear, shame, and helplessness, and one that brought truth, hope, and empowerment. How do you actually do that? A woman named Jennifer asked. In the moment when I'm panicking, I can't think straight enough to evaluate my thoughts. It takes practice, Marcus said. A lot of practice. You won't get it perfect, but you start by just noticing. I'm having anxious thoughts right now. That simple act of observing creates a tiny bit of distance. Then you can start asking, is this thought helpful? Is it based on facts or feelings? What would I tell a friend who had this thought? We spent 2 hours sharing, listening, encouraging. When the meeting ended, several people came up to thank us for creating the space. One man, probably in his 50s, said, I've been dealing with anxiety for 30 years and never told anyone at church. I thought they'd think I didn't have enough faith. Thank you for making it okay to struggle. At school, things were shifting too. Word had spread about how I'd handled Marcus's essay about depression, about the classroom discussion that followed. Other teachers started coming to me with questions about students they were worried about, asking for advice on how to support kids dealing with mental health issues. The principal, Dr. Matthews, called me into her office one afternoon. My immediate reaction was that familiar spike of anxiety. You're in trouble, something's wrong. She's going to criticize you. But I caught it, catastrophizing. I didn't know why she wanted to talk to me. I could wait for actual information before panicking. Thomas, I wanted to discuss something with you, she said once I was seated. We've noticed a positive shift in how students are talking about mental health, more openness, less shame, more willingness to seek help. And several staff members have mentioned that you've been a resource for them in supporting struggling students. Oh, thank you. I'm wondering if you'd be interested in leading a mental health awareness initiative for the school. Nothing that would take away from your teaching. This would be compensated as an additional duty, but training staff on recognizing warning signs, developing resources for students, maybe facilitating some parent education nights. What do you think? What did I think? I thought it was terrifying. I thought it meant being public about my own struggles. I thought it meant risking judgment and exposure. But I also thought it could help a lot of kids. And I thought about what Marcus had said. You're credible because you're living it, not because you've moved past it. I'm interested, I said, but I want to be transparent that I'm currently managing my own anxiety. I'm in therapy, on medication, doing the work. I wouldn't be leading this from a place of I overcame this and you can too. It would be more, this is what I'm learning and how it might help you. Dr. Matthews smiled. That's exactly the perspective we need. We don't need someone who has it all figured out. We need someone who's honest about the struggle and knowledgeable about resources. You're perfect for this. We spent the next 30 minutes outlining what the initiative might look like: staff training on mental health first aid, a resource room where students could go when overwhelmed, partnerships with local therapists, parent education about supporting anxious teens, a peer support program where trained students could help each other. As I walked back to my classroom, I felt that familiar presence, that sense of God's peace that didn't make logical sense. I was taking on more responsibility during a season when I was still actively managing mental health struggles. That should have felt overwhelming, but instead, it felt right, like my pain was being given purpose. That evening, I called Rachel to tell her about the school initiative and the church ministry. "Thomas, that's incredible," she said. "But also, are you sure you're not taking on too much? You're still healing. You need to take care of yourself." "I know, and I'm being careful about that. I'm still in therapy every week. I'm taking my medication. I'm part of a community that's supporting me. But Rachel, I've spent 3 months learning these tools, and they're helping me. Why wouldn't I share them with others who are struggling?" "I'm proud of you. Really proud. 3 months ago, you could barely function. Now you're building ministries and initiatives to help other people. That's transformation." After we hung up, I sat with that word, transformation. Was I transformed? The anxiety wasn't gone. The screaming still happened. I still had hard days, hard moments. But something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't the same person who'd stood on that balcony 3 months ago, desperate and drowning. That night, I wrote in the journal I'd been keeping, 3 months in, the progress isn't linear. Some days I feel almost normal. Other days the anxiety is as intense as ever. But I'm learning that healing doesn't mean the absence of struggle. It means having tools to navigate the struggle. It means not being alone in the struggle. It means believing that the struggle has purpose, even when I can't see what that purpose is yet. The screaming is still there, but so is the voice of peace, and I'm getting better at choosing which one to listen to. The next Sunday, I was asked to give a brief testimony during the service, just 5 minutes about what God was doing in my life. I stood on stage, looking out at several hundred faces, and felt the fear try to take over. They're all judging you. You sound stupid. You're going to mess this up. But I spoke anyway. 3 months ago, I was drowning in anxiety. My mind felt like a war zone. The thoughts were relentless, overwhelming, terrifying, and one night, desperate, I prayed. And God spoke to me. He said, "When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace." I paused, looking out at the faces, some understanding, some curious, all attentive. That phrase changed my life, not because the screaming stopped, it didn't, but because I learned there was another voice, a voice that speaks truth when anxiety speaks lies, a voice that offers peace when panic threatens to overwhelm. And I'm here to tell you, if you're struggling, you're not alone. God hasn't abandoned you. His voice of peace is available, even in the midst of your mental storm. After the service, 7 people approached me, asking about therapy resources, wanting to know how to find help, admitting they'd been suffering in silence. 7 people in one morning, just from 5 minutes of vulnerability. This was why. This was the purpose in the pain. My struggle was becoming a bridge to help others find their way through their own struggles. 3 months wasn't a long time in the scope of a lifetime, but it was long enough to prove that transformation was real, that God's voice was reliable, that healing, while not always linear or complete, was possible. The mind still screamed sometimes, but peace was learning to scream louder. 6 months, half a year since that desperate prayer on my balcony, half a year of learning what it meant to hear God's voice above the noise of anxiety. I marked the milestone in my journal one evening, looking back at where I'd been and marveling at where I was now. The transformation wasn't what I'd expected. I'd thought healing would mean the anxiety disappearing, the racing thoughts stopping, the panic attacks becoming a distant memory. Instead, healing looked like coexistence. The anxiety was still there, some days louder than others, but it no longer controlled my life. I'd learned to function despite it, to recognize it for what it was, to use tools that actually worked. Dr. Warren and I had moved to bi-weekly sessions. "You're managing really well," she'd said at our last appointment. "You have the tools, you have support systems, you know when to reach out for help. I think you're ready for a bit more independence." It felt like graduation and abandonment at the same time. But she'd been right. I was ready. And I could always go back to weekly if I needed to. The mental health ministry at Riverside had grown beyond what any of us expected. We now had 4 different support groups running weekly: anxiety, depression, grief, and trauma. 60 people total, coming through our doors each week, finding community, sharing their struggles, learning they weren't alone. I was co-facilitating the anxiety group with Marcus, and every week I saw people take small steps toward healing. Some started therapy. Some began medication. Some just started being honest about their struggles instead of suffering in silence. All of it mattered. One evening after group, a man named Robert stayed back to talk with me. He was probably in his late 50s, had the weathered look of someone who'd been battling mental illness for a long time. "I've been dealing with anxiety for 30 years, he said. "Been on medication for 20 of those years, and I've always felt ashamed of it. Like needing medication meant I didn't have enough faith, but hearing you talk about how you take medication and go to therapy and also have faith, it helped something click for me. They're not mutually exclusive." "They're really not," I said. "God gave us medication. He gave us brain chemistry that can be helped with medicine. Taking care of our mental health isn't a lack of faith. It's good stewardship of the body and mind He gave us." I've never heard a Christian talk about mental health like this before. Usually it's all, just pray more, or you need to repent, or claim your healing. But you're saying something different. You're saying it's okay to struggle and still be faithful. It's more than okay, it's human. Jesus had compassion for people who were suffering. He didn't tell them to just have more faith and the suffering would disappear. He met them in their pain. Robert's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. I needed to hear that." Conversations like this happened every week. People carrying shame they didn't need to carry, believing lies about what faith meant, convinced that their struggles disqualified them from God's love. And I got to speak truth into those lies, offer hope where there'd been only despair. At school, the mental health initiative was taking shape. We'd done our first staff training, 3 hours on a professional development day, teaching teachers how to recognize warning signs of anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation, how to have difficult conversations with students, how to connect them with resources, how to support without trying to fix. The response had been mixed. Most staff were grateful for the training, eager to help students better. But a few resisted, thought we were pathologizing normal teenage stress, worried we were overstepping our role as educators. One teacher, Mr. Harrison, had been particularly vocal in his criticism. "We're teachers, not therapists," he'd said during the Q&A. "Our job is to teach content, not manage kids' emotions." I tried to stay calm, to respond with grace. "I agree we're not therapists, but we are adults in these kids' lives. And sometimes we're the first to notice when a student is struggling. We're not asking you to provide therapy. We're just asking you to recognize when a kid needs help and know how to connect them with that help." He'd grumbled something about how kids today were too soft, too coddled, and sat down. But later, 3 other teachers had come up to me privately to thank me for the training, to share their own struggles with mental health, to say how much they wished they'd had these resources when they were younger. Progress was messy. Not everyone would understand, not everyone would agree, but enough people were being helped that the resistance didn't stop the work. One afternoon, a student named Sophia came to my classroom after school. She was one of my best students in creative writing, insightful, articulate, always turning in thoughtful work. But today, She looked exhausted, her eyes red like she'd been crying. "Mr. Morgan, can I talk to you about something?" "Of course. Come in. Sit down." She settled into a desk in the front row, twisted her hands nervously. "I've been dealing with really bad anxiety, like panic attacks, can't sleep, can't focus, and it's affecting my grades. I'm worried about college applications, and that's making the anxiety worse, and it's this vicious cycle." "I'm so sorry you're dealing with that, Sophia. Have you talked to anyone about it? Your parents? A counselor?" "My parents don't really believe in mental health stuff. They think I just need to try harder, stress less, stop overthinking. But I can't just turn it off. I've tried." I saw myself in her. The same desperation. The same feeling of being trapped in your own mind. The same isolation of thinking no one would understand. "Sophia, what you're experiencing is real. Anxiety disorder is a real medical condition. It's not something you can just willpower your way through. You need help, professional help, therapy, maybe medication. And your parents need to understand that this isn't about trying harder. This is about your brain chemistry needing support." But how do I make them understand that? Would it help if I talked to them? I could call them, explain what I've observed as your teacher, recommend that they connect you with resources. Relief washed over her face. "Would you really do that?" "Absolutely. But Sophia, I also want you to know something. I deal with anxiety too. Severe anxiety. I'm in therapy, I'm on medication, and I'm learning to manage it. And I'm telling you this because I want you to know that struggling doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're human. And getting help doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're being wise." She started crying. "I've felt so alone. Like I was the only one who couldn't handle normal life. Like everyone else had it together, and I was falling apart." "You're not alone. Not even close. Anxiety affects millions of people, and there's help available. You don't have to suffer through this by yourself." I called Sophia's parents that evening. Her mother answered, initially defensive when I brought up anxiety. "She's always been a worrier," she said. "She just needs to learn to relax." "Mrs. Chen, with all due respect, what Sophia is describing isn't just worrying. She's having panic attacks. She's not sleeping. This is affecting her academic performance and her daily functioning. This is beyond what a teenager should just learn to deal with. She needs professional evaluation and support." There was a long pause. Then her mother's voice softened. "I didn't realize it was that serious. I thought she was just stressed about school." Stress and anxiety disorder are different things. I'm happy to send you some resources about anxiety in teens, information about local therapists who specialize in adolescent mental health. But the most important thing is that Sophia knows you're taking this seriously and that you're on her side. We talked for 20 more minutes. By the end, Mrs. Chen was asking questions, taking notes, agreeing to schedule an evaluation with a therapist. One conversation, one kid potentially getting the help she needed. That Sunday, Pastor David asked if I'd be willing to share my full testimony during the morning service. Not just 5 minutes. The whole story. He thought it could be powerful for the congregation to hear a detailed account of what God had done in my life. I said yes, even though the thought terrified me. Standing in front of 500 people, being that vulnerable, risking that level of exposure, every anxious thought I'd ever had about public judgment came screaming back. But I'd learned something over the past 6 months. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's taking action despite the fear. And if my story could help even one person feel less alone, it was worth the discomfort. The week leading up to Sunday, I wrote and rewrote my testimony. What to include, what to leave out, how to be honest without being self-indulgent, how to point to God without making it sound like a simple, "I prayed and everything got better" story. Because it wasn't simple. God had answered my prayer, but not by magically removing the anxiety. He'd answered by teaching me to hear his voice above the noise, by leading me to therapy and medication, by surrounding me with community, by giving me tools and showing me how to use them, by redeeming my pain with purpose. Saturday night before the testimony, I barely slept. The anxious thoughts were relentless. You're going to stumble over your words. People will think you're weak. This is self-indulgent. You're making your struggle the focus instead of making God the focus. You're going to regret this. But in the midst of the screaming, I heard it. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. What did that voice say? You're not sharing your struggle to glorify yourself. You're sharing it to give hope to others who are struggling. Your vulnerability might help someone else be vulnerable. Your honesty about the hard parts might help someone else be honest. Sunday morning, I stood on the stage at Riverside Fellowship. The sanctuary was full, probably close to 600 people between both services. I looked out at the faces and saw Marcus and Elena, Susan, the members of the anxiety support group, colleagues from school, students who attended Riverside, my sister Rachel and her family who'd driven in to support me. "My name is Thomas," I began, my voice shaking slightly, "and 6 months ago, I was drowning in my own mind. For the next 20 minutes, I told the whole story. The 6 months of mental torture before I prayed, the racing thoughts, the panic attacks, the insomnia, the isolation and shame, the conviction that I was broken beyond repair, the desperate prayer on my balcony when I'd run out of options, the moment God spoke. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. I talked about the journey since then, starting therapy, beginning medication, finding community at Riverside, learning to distinguish between anxious thoughts and truth, the ongoing nature of the battle, that I still struggled, still had hard days, still heard the screaming. I'm not standing here to tell you that faith eliminates mental illness, I said. I still deal with anxiety. I'm still in therapy. I'm still on medication. But I've learned something crucial. God's voice of peace doesn't wait until you have it all together. It's available right now, in the midst of your struggle. You don't have to be healed to hear it. You just have to be willing to listen. I talked about the tools I'd learned, cognitive behavioral therapy, challenging distorted thoughts, breathing exercises, community support, medication when needed, prayer and scripture, all of it working together, not competing with each other. Some people think faith and therapy are incompatible, that if you really trusted God, you wouldn't need professional help. But that's a lie. God gave us medication. He gave us the field of psychology. He gave us people who are trained to help with mental health. Using those resources isn't a lack of faith. It's wise stewardship of the life God gave us. I closed with an invitation. If you're struggling with anxiety, depression, intrusive thoughts, panic, you're not alone. And you don't have to suffer in silence. There's help available, and there's a God who meets you in your pain, who speaks peace into your chaos, who walks with you through the healing process. When I finished, the sanctuary was silent. Then Pastor David stood and said, "Let's thank Thomas for his vulnerability." The applause was thunderous, but more importantly, I saw faces, dozens of them, with tears streaming down their cheeks, faces that said, "Me too. I'm not alone. There's hope." After the service, I was surrounded. 50 people, maybe more, wanting to share their own stories, ask for resources, thank me for being honest. One woman, probably in her 60s, said, "I've battled depression for 40 years and never told anyone at church. I thought they'd judge me. Thank you for making it safe to struggle." A young guy, early 20s, said, "I've been suicidal. I have a plan. I was going to do it this week, but hearing your story today, maybe there's another way. Maybe I should get help." I connected him immediately with Susan, who was trained in crisis intervention. She walked him through getting emergency support, made sure he wasn't alone, helped him develop a safety plan. One life, potentially saved, because I'd been willing to be vulnerable about my struggle. That afternoon, exhausted but grateful, I sat on my balcony, the same spot where 6 months ago I'd prayed that desperate prayer, and I thanked God, not for removing the anxiety, He hadn't, but for meeting me in it, for speaking peace when my mind was screaming, for teaching me that healing wasn't the absence of struggle, but the presence of hope in the midst of struggle. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. I'd been listening for 6 months, and I'd keep listening for the rest of my life. Because that voice, that quiet, steady, truthful voice, was the difference between drowning and surviving, between isolation and community, between despair and hope, between screaming and peace. 9 months after that night on the balcony, I found myself in a coffee shop on a Saturday afternoon, waiting for someone I'd never met in person but had been emailing with for weeks. Her name was Grace, and she was the new music director at Riverside Fellowship. We'd been introduced through email by Susan, who thought we'd have a lot in common. Grace had recently moved to the city to take the music director position, didn't know many people yet, and Susan thought it would be good for her to have someone show her around, help her get connected. What Susan hadn't mentioned, but what came out in our email exchanges, was that Grace's younger brother had died by suicide 3 years ago. He'd struggled with depression, had been in and out of treatment, and one day the pain had just been too much. Grace had been devastated, angry at God, questioning her faith, but through the grief, she'd developed a passion for mental health advocacy, particularly in faith communities. "Too many churches don't know how to talk about mental illness," she'd written in one email. "They either ignore it or spiritualize it, and people suffer in silence because they think admitting they're struggling means they don't have enough faith." I'd known immediately that Susan was right. Grace and I would have a lot in common. She walked into the coffee shop at exactly 2 o'clock, looking around uncertainly until I waved. She was probably around my age, with short dark hair, warm brown eyes, and a tentative smile. "Thomas? That's me. Grace?" "Yes. It's so good to finally meet you in person." We ordered drinks. She got chai tea. I got my usual black coffee, and settled into a corner table by the window. "So," she said, "Susan tells me you've become kind of the mental health guy at church." I laughed. "I don't know if I'd put it that way, but I've been open about my own struggles with anxiety, and that's led to co-facilitating support groups and doing some teaching on mental health and faith." "That's amazing. How did you get comfortable being so public about it?" "That's something I struggle with. Wanting to advocate for mental health, but also feeling vulnerable about sharing my own story. Honestly, I didn't feel comfortable. I still don't always feel comfortable, but I kept hearing the same thing from people. I thought I was the only one. I thought struggling meant I was a bad Christian. Thank you for making it okay to not be okay. And I realized my discomfort was worth it if it helped people feel less alone." We talked for 3 hours. About her brother, about my anxiety, about the church's often problematic relationship with mental illness, about theology, what it means to trust God when you're suffering, whether faith should eliminate pain or help you endure it, how to reconcile a good God with the reality of mental anguish. "I was so angry at God after my brother died," Grace said. "People kept telling me it was part of God's plan, that God needed another angel, all these platitudes that made me want to scream. Because if it was God's plan for my brother to suffer that much and then die, I didn't want anything to do with that God." What changed? I met a pastor who told me the truth, that God didn't cause my brother's death, that mental illness exists because we live in a broken world. That God was grieving with me, not orchestrating my pain, that God's heart breaks for every person who suffers with depression, anxiety, any mental illness. And slowly, I came back to faith. But it looks different now, less about having all the answers, more about trusting God's character even when I don't understand his ways. I understood that completely. My faith had been transformed over the past 9 months too. I'd gone from barely believing God existed to having daily conversations with him. But it wasn't a tidy, comfortable faith. It was a faith forged in struggle, marked by questions, sustained by hope rather than certainty. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said. "The anxiety, does it ever fully go away?" "No, at least not for me. Some days it's barely there, just background noise. Other days it's loud and intrusive. But I've learned to manage it, to have tools that actually work. to recognize it for what it is instead of believing it's telling me truth. Do you ever worry it will get as bad as it was before you got help? Sometimes. That's actually one of my recurring anxious thoughts, that all this progress is temporary, that I'll wake up one day and be back at square one. But then I remind myself of what's different now. I have a therapist. I have medication that helps. I have a community that knows and supports me. I have tools. I'm not the same person I was 9 months ago. And even if the anxiety gets loud again, I know how to handle it now. Grace nodded thoughtfully. I think that's what I'm still learning with grief, that it doesn't go away, but you learn to carry it differently. You learn to integrate it into your life instead of being crushed by it. Before we left, Grace asked, "Would you want to do this again? Coffee, I mean. I've really enjoyed talking with you." "Yeah, I'd like that." Over the next few weeks, Grace and I became friends. We met for coffee, went to art museums, took walks in the park. She told me more about her brother, his sense of humor, his love of music, the way depression had slowly stolen the light from his eyes. I told her more about my journey with anxiety, the depths I'd been in, the slow climb out, the ongoing work of managing mental health. There was something easy about being with Grace. She understood struggle in a way that didn't require explanation. She'd sat in the darkness herself, knew what it was like to fight battles no one else could see. We could be honest with each other without fear of judgment. One evening after the Wednesday service, Marcus pulled me aside. "So, you and Grace seem to be spending a lot of time together." I felt heat rise in my face. "We're friends. She's new in town. I'm helping her get connected." Marcus grinned. "Right. Friends. And the way she looks at you. That's just friendly? What are you talking about? Thomas, come on. You can't be that oblivious. She's into you. And from what I can see, you're into her too." Was I? I'd been so focused on mental health, on managing anxiety, on building stability, that I hadn't even considered dating. The idea of adding relationship complexity to my life felt overwhelming. But Marcus had a point. I did enjoy being with Grace. I looked forward to our conversations. I felt comfortable with her in a way I didn't with most people. "What if my anxiety is too much?" I said. "What if I'm not ready for a relationship? What if I mess it up? What if it's great? What if she's exactly what you need?" Thomas, you can't let fear make all your decisions. Sometimes you have to risk being vulnerable. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was spinning, not with the usual catastrophic scenarios, but with possibilities. What would it be like to date Grace? Would she understand when I had bad anxiety days? Would she be patient with the fact that I was still in therapy, still on medication, still learning? Would she see my mental health struggles as a weakness or just as part of who I was? When your mind screams, "Listen to my voice of peace," the anxious thoughts were there. You're not ready. You'll burden her with your problems. She deserves someone more stable. You'll mess this up. But underneath those thoughts was something quieter. You like her, she likes you. You're allowed to pursue connection, even though you're not perfect. Healing doesn't mean having it all together. It means being brave enough to let people in. The next time Grace and I met for coffee, I was honest with her. "I need to tell you something. I really enjoy spending time with you, and I'm wondering if maybe we could, I don't know, go on an actual date, instead of just hanging out as friends." She smiled, and I saw relief in her eyes. "I was hoping you'd say something like that. I've been wanting to ask you, but I wasn't sure if you were interested or if you were just being friendly." "I'm interested, but I also want to be honest with you about something. I'm still managing anxiety. Some days are harder than others. I'm in therapy, I'm on medication, and I'm doing well, but it's not gone. And I don't want to start something with you without you knowing that. Thomas, I know you've been honest about your mental health from the beginning. And honestly, that's part of what I appreciate about you. You're not pretending to be someone you're not. You're doing the work to take care of yourself. That's attractive, not a red flag." We went on our first official date that weekend. Dinner at a small Italian restaurant, then a walk along the river. We talked about everything: faith, family, dreams, fears. Grace told me about her work as a music director, how she used music to help people connect with God in ways words couldn't. I told her about the mental health initiative at school, about seeing students get the help they needed. At one point she said, "Can I ask you something? What does a bad anxiety day look like for you? I want to understand what you're dealing with." I appreciated her directness. "It varies. Sometimes it's just intrusive thoughts that won't stop, racing, catastrophic thinking that I have to actively work to counter. Sometimes it's physical, racing heart, tight chest, feeling like I can't breathe. Sometimes it's just this overwhelming sense of dread that I can't explain or rationalize. On really bad days, it's all of the above. What helps when you're in that place? Depends. Sometimes I need to be alone and use my coping tools, breathing exercises, grounding techniques, challenging the thoughts. Sometimes I need to talk through it with someone I trust. Sometimes I just need to ride it out, knowing it will pass even though it feels overwhelming in the moment. And what would you need from a partner on days like that? The question made my throat tight. She wasn't running. She was leaning in, trying to understand, figuring out how to support me. Honestly, just patience, not trying to fix it or make it go away, but also not treating me like I'm fragile, reminding me of what's true when the anxiety is lying to me, being okay with the fact that sometimes I'm not okay. "I can do that," she said simply. By the end of the evening, walking her to her car, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope about the future. Not just hope that my anxiety would be manageable, but hope that good things could happen. That I could build a life that included struggle, but wasn't defined by struggle. That I could be loved, mental health issues and all. Over the next few months, Grace and I fell into a rhythm. We saw each other several times a week, dates, church events, just hanging out. She met Rachel and the kids, who loved her immediately. I met her parents, who drove in for a weekend and treated me with warmth, despite knowing about my anxiety struggles. There were hard moments. One evening I had to cancel plans because I was having a particularly bad anxiety day and couldn't function socially. I was terrified she'd be upset, that this would be the moment she realized I was too much work, but she just texted back, "No problem. Do what you need to take care of yourself. I'm here if you need anything." Another time, we were at a crowded church event, and I felt a panic attack coming on. That familiar tightness in my chest, the racing heart, the sense that I needed to escape. I excused myself, went outside, did my breathing exercises. Grace followed after a few minutes, found me sitting on a bench. "You okay?" "Panic attack. I'm managing it. Sorry for disappearing." She sat next to me, not crowding, just being present. "Don't apologize. Do you need anything? Can you just sit with me? Not talk, just sit." She sat with me for 20 minutes while I worked through the panic, using my tools, waiting for it to pass. When I finally felt stable again, I looked at her. "Thank you for not making this weird." "Why would I make it weird? You have panic attacks sometimes. I know that about you. It doesn't change how I feel about you." "You're really okay with this? With dating someone who deals with this stuff?" "Thomas, everyone has stuff. Yours happens to be anxiety. My stuff is grief and trust issues from watching my brother struggle. We're all carrying something. The question isn't whether you have struggles, it's whether you're dealing with them honestly and healthily. And you are." That conversation shifted something in me. I'd been so afraid that my anxiety would be the thing that disqualified me from love, from relationship, from normalcy. But Grace was showing me that it could just be part of the package, not the defining characteristic. At therapy, Dr. Warren, now seeing me monthly for maintenance, smiled when I told her about Grace. "That's wonderful. How does being in a relationship affect your anxiety?" "It triggers some new worries about being good enough, about burdening her, about the relationship not working out. But it's also been stabilizing. Having someone who knows about the anxiety and doesn't freak out about it, who reminds me of truth when I'm spiraling. It's helpful. That's exactly what a healthy relationship should do, not fix your problems, but support you in managing them. It sounds like you've found someone who understands that." The mental health ministry at church had continued growing. We now had 6 different support groups, a trained crisis response team, partnerships with local therapists who offered sliding scale rates for church members. And the culture had shifted. People talked openly about therapy, about medication, about struggle. At school, we'd implemented the mental health initiative fully. Every staff member trained, resources available in every classroom, peer support groups for students, parent education nights, and the impact was visible. Students were seeking help earlier, talking more openly, supporting each other better. 9 months wasn't forever. I knew I'd have hard days ahead. I knew anxiety would flare up, that I'd have setbacks, that this wasn't a journey with a finish line. But I also knew I wasn't walking it alone. I had Grace, who loved me without trying to fix me. I had community at Riverside, who saw me fully and still welcomed me. I had students and colleagues who trusted me enough to be vulnerable. I had family who supported me unconditionally. And I had God, whose voice of peace had been faithful for 9 months and would be faithful for however many more months, years, decades I had ahead. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. The mind still screamed, but peace was getting louder. 1 year, 12 months since that desperate prayer on my balcony, when I'd been at the end of myself and God had spoken words that would reshape my entire life. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. I marked the anniversary on a Tuesday evening, sitting in the same spot where it had all begun. The balcony looked the same railing, same view of the city, same sounds of traffic and life happening below. But I was different, fundamentally, profoundly different. A year ago, I'd been drowning. Now I was learning to swim. The anxiety hadn't disappeared. That's what I wanted people to understand most. Healing from mental illness doesn't always mean the complete absence of symptoms. Some days I still woke up with racing thoughts. Some nights I still struggled to sleep. Some moments the panic still tried to overwhelm me. But I had tools now. I knew how to challenge distorted thoughts. I knew breathing techniques that actually calmed my nervous system. I knew when to push through discomfort and when to ask for help. I knew the difference between anxiety lying to me and intuition guiding me. Grace came over that evening, bringing takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant. She found me on the balcony, lost in thought, and wrapped her arms around me from behind. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "It's been exactly a year since God spoke to me here, since everything started changing." She came around to sit beside me. "Tell me what's different now, between then and now." I thought about it. Everything and nothing. The anxiety is still there. It'll probably always be there to some degree. But a year ago, the anxiety was in control. I was just reacting to it, being tossed around by it, believing everything it told me. Now, I'm in control. Not of whether I have anxiety, I can't control that, but of how I respond to it. And that makes all the difference. What else? I'm not alone anymore. A year ago, I was suffering in isolation, convinced I had to handle everything myself. Now I have you. I have community at Riverside. I have students and colleagues who know my story. I have a therapist I trust. I'm surrounded by people who understand struggle. Grace squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you, really proud. The work you've done this year, the vulnerability, the perseverance, the willingness to help others even while you're still healing yourself. It's incredible. I couldn't have done it without you. You know that, right? You were doing the work before you met me. But I'm glad I get to walk alongside you now." We ate dinner on the balcony as the sun set, talking about the year ahead. Grace's contract at Riverside had been extended. She'd be staying long-term. My mental health initiative at school had been so successful that the school board wanted to implement it district-wide, which meant I'd be training teachers at other schools, developing curriculum, expanding the reach. The mental health ministry at church was considering hiring a part-time coordinator because it had grown beyond what volunteers alone could manage. "Do you ever feel overwhelmed by how much your life has changed?" Grace asked. "All the time. A year ago I was barely functioning. Now I'm dating someone I love, leading a ministry, impacting students, speaking publicly about mental health. Sometimes I look at my life and don't recognize it, but it's a good kind of disorientation. You've turned your pain into purpose. That's powerful. I had help. God took my mess and started making something meaningful out of it. I'm just trying to cooperate with what He's doing. The following week, I got an email that would shift things in an unexpected direction. It was from a publisher who'd heard me speak at a mental health and faith conference that Riverside had hosted. They wanted to know if I'd be interested in writing a book about my journey, specifically a book for Christians struggling with mental illness who were told their struggles meant they lacked faith. My immediate reaction was panic. You're not a writer, you're not qualified. Who would want to read your story? What if you mess this up? What if people criticize you? But I'd learned to recognize those thoughts for what they were. Anxiety trying to protect me from risk by convincing me I wasn't capable. So I wrote back saying I was interested but wanted to discuss it further before committing to anything. We set up a call for the following week. The editor, a woman named Michelle, was warm and enthusiastic. Your story resonates because it's honest, she said. You're not claiming that faith eliminates mental illness. You're not selling false hope. You're just sharing your journey of learning to hear God's voice in the midst of psychological struggle. That's what people need to hear. I'm not a professional writer, I admitted. You're a teacher. You know how to communicate clearly, and you have a story worth telling. We'd pair you with a developmental editor who'd help shape the manuscript. This isn't about you doing it alone. It's collaborative. I told her I needed time to think and pray about it. After we hung up, I sat with the opportunity, trying to discern whether this was something I should pursue or something anxiety was making seem bigger than it was. At therapy that week, still monthly maintenance sessions, I brought it up with Dr. Warren. I got an offer to write a book about my mental health journey, and I don't know if it's a good opportunity or if I'm taking on too much. What does your gut tell you? My gut says I want to do it, that it could help a lot of people. But my anxiety says I'm not qualified, I'll fail, I'm overextending myself. Those are very different voices, aren't they? Your gut, which I'd argue is probably intuition, maybe God's guidance, says this aligns with your values and could be meaningful. Your anxiety says you should stay small and safe. Which voice do you want to listen to? The first one, but it's scary. Of course it's scary. Growth is always uncomfortable. But you've proven over this past year that you can do scary things. You've been vulnerable in front of hundreds of people. You've built ministries. You've helped students and adults get mental health support. Writing a book isn't more difficult than those things. It's just different. She was right. I'd been doing scary things for a year. Why stop now? I emailed Michelle back and said yes, we'd start with a detailed outline, then move to chapter drafts. The timeline was ambitious but manageable. Manuscript due in 6 months. It would mean early mornings and late nights, working around my teaching schedule and church commitments. But it felt right. Grace was excited when I told her. This is perfect for you. You've been helping individuals and small groups. Now you can help people you'll never meet. People in small towns where there's no mental health support. People in churches where they're told to just pray more. Your story can reach them. The mental health ministry had reached a point where it needed more structure. Susan called a meeting with Marcus, me, and a few others who'd been heavily involved. We need to talk about sustainability, she said. We're burning out trying to run this all as volunteers, while also having full-time jobs and lives. I think we need to ask the church to hire someone part-time. The idea made sense. We were now running 6 support groups weekly, training lay counselors, providing crisis response, partnering with therapists, hosting education events. It was more than volunteers alone could sustain. We put together a proposal for the church board. Within a month, they approved funding for a part-time mental health ministry coordinator, and they asked me to help interview candidates. You've been instrumental in building this, Pastor David said. Your input on who leads it going forward matters. We interviewed 5 people. One stood out immediately, a woman named Dr. Lisa Chen, a licensed therapist who'd recently semi-retired from full-time practice and was looking for part-time work that combined her clinical expertise with ministry. She'd lost her husband to suicide 10 years ago, had her own journey through grief and trauma, and had a deep passion for helping churches become safe spaces for mental health struggles. Too many Christians die by suicide because they're ashamed to admit they're struggling, she said during the interview. Too many people with mental illness leave the church because they don't feel welcome. I want to change that. I want to build a ministry where struggle is expected, vulnerability is normalized, and getting help is celebrated. We hired her on the spot. Dr. Chen started immediately, bringing both clinical expertise and lived experience to the role. She reorganized the support groups for better structure, created training programs for lay counselors that were more comprehensive, established clearer protocols for when someone needed professional help beyond what the groups could provide. And she asked me to co-teach a class with her, Faith and Mental Health 101, 6 weeks, covering topics like the biology of mental illness, the theology of suffering, how to support loved ones with mental health struggles, when to seek professional help, how medication works, the role of spiritual practices in mental wellness. You bring the personal testimony and the theological framing, she said. I'll bring the clinical information. Together, we can give people a holistic understanding. The class filled up immediately. 40 people registered, with a waiting list for the next session. Christians hungry for information, desperate to understand their own struggles or their loved ones' struggles, tired of simplistic answers that didn't match their lived experience. Teaching alongside Dr. Chen was illuminating. When I shared about cognitive distortions, she explained the neuroscience behind why our brains develop those patterns. When she talked about medication, I shared my own experience of starting an SSRI and what it had been like. When I discussed the spiritual practice of taking thoughts captive, she connected it to CBT techniques. Theory and practice, clinical and personal, science and faith, all woven together. During the Q&A in week 3, a man raised his hand. I've been on antidepressants for 5 years. And people at my previous church made me feel like that meant I didn't trust God enough. Like if I really had faith, I wouldn't need medication. How do you respond to that? Dr. Chen answered first. Depression is a medical condition involving brain chemistry. Telling someone with depression to just pray more is like telling someone with diabetes to just have more faith instead of taking insulin. God gave us medication. He gave us the scientific understanding to develop treatments. Using those treatments isn't a lack of faith. It's good stewardship of the body He gave you. I added my perspective. I take medication for anxiety, and I also pray, read scripture, go to therapy, use coping skills. All of it works together. God doesn't just work through supernatural means. He works through doctors, therapists, medication, community. Faith and treatment aren't competing, they're complementary. The man's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. I've carried so much shame about needing medication. It helps to hear that I'm not failing spiritually by taking care of my mental health. These conversations happened every week. People finding permission to struggle, to get help, to be honest. People learning that mental illness wasn't a spiritual problem, but a human problem. People discovering that God's love wasn't conditional on their mental wellness. At school, Sophia, the student I'd helped connect with therapy a few months ago, came to my classroom one afternoon with an update. Mr. Morgan, I wanted to tell you something. I'm doing so much better. The therapy is helping. My parents are supportive. I started medication and it's made a huge difference. And I wanted to thank you for taking me seriously, for not minimizing what I was going through. I'm so glad you're getting help, Sophia. How are things going with school stress and college applications? Still stressful, but manageable now. I have tools, and I know that even on hard days I'm not alone. You taught me that. Stories like Sophia's were becoming common. Students finding help, teachers learning to recognize warning signs, parents getting educated about adolescent mental health. The culture was shifting, one conversation at a time. Grace and I celebrated our 6-month anniversary with a weekend trip to the mountains. We hiked, talked for hours, sat by a campfire at night looking at stars. One evening she said, "I need to tell you something. I'm falling in love with you. Actually, I think I already have fallen in love with you, and I wanted you to know." My breath caught. "I love you too. I've been wanting to say it, but I was scared it was too soon." She laughed. "We're both overthinkers, aren't we? It's part of our charm. Can I ask you something? Do you ever worry that your anxiety will get bad again, that you'll end up back where you were a year ago?" "Sometimes. That's one of my recurring fears, that all this progress is temporary, that I'll wake up one day and be back at square one. But then I remember what Dr. Warren told me. You're not the same person you were a year ago. Even if the anxiety gets loud again, you have tools now, you have support. You know the path to healing because you've walked it before." That makes sense. I have similar fears about my grief, that it'll swallow me whole again like it did right after my brother died. But I'm not the same person I was 3 years ago either. I've learned to carry the grief differently. We're both learning to live with our struggles instead of being defined by them. That's what I love about you. You don't pretend you have it all together. You're honest about the hard parts, and you're still building a beautiful life despite them. As we sat by the fire, Grace's head on my shoulder, I thought about the year's journey, from desperate and alone to loved and purposeful. From convinced I was broken beyond repair to understanding that brokenness and wholeness could coexist. When your mind screams, "Listen to my voice of peace." That phrase had carried me through 12 months, through panic attacks and sleepless nights, through vulnerability and risk, through the hard work of therapy and the gradual changes from medication, through building community and finding love, through turning pain into purpose. The mind still screamed sometimes. But I'd learned to hear another voice, a voice that spoke truth when anxiety spoke lies, a voice that offered hope when fear offered despair, a voice that reminded me I was never alone, never abandoned, never beyond the reach of peace. And that voice was what made the difference between surviving and thriving. 18 months, a year and a half since God had spoken those words on my balcony. 547 days of learning what it meant to hear his voice of peace above the screaming of anxiety. Nearly 80 weeks of transformation that had been gradual, difficult, beautiful, and ongoing. I was sitting in a hotel conference room in Chicago, about to speak at a national conference on faith and mental health. 500 people in attendance, pastors, counselors, people with lived experience, advocates. And I was the closing keynote speaker. Me, Thomas Morgan, high school English teacher who 18 months ago couldn't get through a day without a panic attack. The irony wasn't lost on me. Grace was sitting in the front row, along with Marcus and Susan, who'd flown in to support me. Dr. Warren had sent a card that morning. "Proud of you, remember, you're not an expert, you're just honest. That's what people need." As I waited to be introduced, the familiar anxiety tried to surface. What if you forget what you're going to say? What if people think you're a fraud? What if you have a panic attack on stage? What if this whole thing is a disaster? But I'd learned to recognize these thoughts for what they were. Fear, trying to keep me small and safe. Anxiety doing its job of scanning for threats, even when there weren't any real threats present. I took a breath and listened deeper. When your mind screams, "Listen to my voice of peace." What did that voice say? You have a story worth telling. These people need to hear it. Your vulnerability will help others be vulnerable. You're prepared, you're supported, you're not alone. The conference organizer introduced me, sharing a brief version of my story. And then I walked onto the stage, looked out at 500 faces, and began. My name is Thomas, and 18 months ago I was convinced I was losing my mind. For the next 45 minutes, I told the whole story. The 6 months of mental torture, the isolation and shame, the desperate prayer, the moment God spoke, The journey since, therapy, medication, community, learning to distinguish between anxious thoughts and truth, the ongoing nature of the battle. I'm not standing here to tell you I'm healed, I said. I still deal with anxiety. I still have hard days. I still hear the screaming sometimes, but I've learned something crucial. God's voice of peace doesn't wait until you're perfectly well to speak to you. It's available right now in the midst of your struggle. You don't have to be healed to hear it. You just have to be willing to listen. I talked about the lies the church sometimes tells about mental illness, that it's a spiritual problem requiring only spiritual solutions, that medication means you don't trust God, that if you just prayed more, it would go away, that struggling means you're a bad Christian. These lies kill people, I said bluntly. They keep people from getting the help they need. They add shame to suffering. They make people choose between their faith and their mental health, and they're not true. God gave us medication. He gave us therapy. He gave us the field of psychology and neuroscience. Using those resources isn't a lack of faith. It's wise stewardship. I shared practical tools. How to challenge distorted thoughts. How to create safety plans for mental health crises. How to build support networks. How to have difficult conversations about mental illness in church contexts. How to integrate faith and treatment instead of seeing them as competing. And I shared the phrase that had changed my life. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. The screaming will probably never fully stop, I said. Anxiety, depression, OCD, trauma. These conditions are often chronic. They're things you learn to manage, not things that disappear forever. But that doesn't mean you're stuck. That doesn't mean there's no hope. Because alongside the screaming, there's another voice. God's voice, a voice that speaks truth, hope, peace, a voice that reminds you you're not alone, you're not abandoned, you're not beyond help. And the more you practice listening to that voice, the louder it gets. I closed with a challenge. If you're here today and you're struggling with mental illness, get help, talk to a therapist, see a psychiatrist if needed, build a support network, be honest with safe people about what you're going through. Don't suffer in silence because you think struggling means you're failing spiritually. And if you're a pastor, a counselor, a friend of someone who's struggling, create safe spaces. Stop spiritualizing mental illness. Stop offering simple answers to complex problems. Listen more than you talk. Support without trying to fix. Remind people of God's love without adding shame to their suffering. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then someone started clapping. And then everyone was standing, applauding, and I saw faces throughout the room with tears streaming down them. Afterward, I was surrounded. Dozens of people wanting to share their stories, ask for resources, thank me for being honest. One pastor said, I've been dealing with depression for years and hiding it from my congregation because I thought they'd lose respect for me. Hearing you speak gave me courage to be honest. A young woman, probably early 20s, said, I've been suicidal. I have a plan, but hearing your story today, maybe there's hope. Maybe I should try therapy again. Thank you for not giving up. And I connected her immediately with a crisis counselor at the conference, made sure she had resources, watched as she was surrounded by people who refused to let her face the darkness alone. One conversation at a time, one story at a time, one person finding hope in the midst of despair. This was why I'd gone through 18 months of hell. This was the redemption. The book I'd been writing for 6 months was nearly finished. Michelle, my editor, had been amazing, helping me shape my story, pushing me to go deeper, making sure I was balancing vulnerability with wisdom. The working title was When Your Mind Screams, Finding God's Voice in the Chaos of Mental Illness. This is going to help so many people, Michelle said during one of our calls. You're giving language to something a lot of Christians experience but don't know how to talk about. The manuscript was due in 2 weeks. Then it would go through editing, design, all the production steps. Publication date was set for 10 months out. It felt surreal. My story, my struggle, my journey with God would be in bookstores, on Amazon, in people's hands. What if no one reads it? I'd ask Grace one evening while working on final revisions. Then it helps the people who do read it. You can't control the outcome. You can only do the work you're called to do and trust God with the results. She was right. I'd been learning that lesson over and over. I couldn't control outcomes, only effort. I couldn't guarantee results, only faithfulness to the work in front of me. At Riverside, the mental health ministry had continued flourishing under Dr. Chen's leadership. We now had 8 support groups, a robust training program for lay counselors, partnerships with a dozen local therapists, and a culture where mental health was openly discussed without shame. I'd transitioned from co-facilitating the anxiety group to serving on the leadership team, helping with vision and strategy, while Dr. Chen handled day-to-day operations. It was the right move. I'd been pouring out for 18 months, and I needed to pull back slightly to avoid burnout. "You've done incredible work," Dr. Chen said when we discussed the transition. "But sustainability requires knowing your limits. You can't help others if you're depleted yourself." At school, the mental health initiative had expanded district-wide. I was now training teachers at 5 different schools, developing curriculum, consulting with administrators. It was more work, but it was compensated work that made a real difference. And I got to see the ripple effects. Students getting help earlier, teachers feeling equipped to support struggling kids, parents learning to recognize warning signs. One afternoon, Marcus, my former student who'd shared his essay about depression, came back to visit. He was home from college for spring break and wanted to catch up. "Mr. Morgan, I have to tell you something. That essay I wrote, the one about my depression, I used it for my college admissions personal statement, and I think it's why I got into my top choice school." The admissions officer told me it was the most honest, vulnerable essay she'd read that year. "That's incredible, Marcus. How are you doing now?" "Better. Still in therapy, still on medication, but I'm managing, and I joined a mental health advocacy group on campus. We're working to reduce stigma, increase resources, support students who are struggling. Your class inspired me to turn my pain into something that helps others." Stories like this reminded me why the vulnerability was worth it, why the risk of exposure was worth it, why being honest about struggle mattered more than protecting my image. Grace and I had been dating for 9 months. We'd navigated the normal relationship stuff, learning each other's quirks, having our first real argument and working through it, meeting extended family, talking about future possibilities. But we'd also navigated the mental health stuff, me having anxiety flare-ups and her supporting me through them, her having grief episodes, and me learning how to be present without trying to fix anything. "I want to talk about something," she said one evening over dinner at her apartment, "and I don't want you to freak out." My anxiety immediately offered suggestions. "She's breaking up with you. She's realized you're too much work. She's moving away. Something's wrong." But I caught the thoughts. "Okay, I'm listening. I love you, and I love us. And I've been thinking about the future. Not immediate future. I'm not proposing or anything, but long-term future. And I want to make sure we're on the same page about what we want." Relief washed over me. This wasn't bad news. This was just a conversation. "What do you want to know? Do you want to get married someday? Do you want kids? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? I need to know if we're heading in the same direction." We talked for 3 hours. About marriage, yes, both of us wanted that eventually. About kids, yes, though we both had concerns about how mental health struggles might affect parenting. About careers, I wanted to keep teaching but also do more speaking and writing. She wanted to continue in music ministry long-term. About where we'd live, open to staying in this city or moving if the right opportunity came up. "I want a future with you," I said. "I'm not ready to get engaged today, but I'm moving in that direction. You're it for me, Grace." She smiled, tears in her eyes. "You're it for me, too." That night, lying in bed unable to sleep because my mind was spinning with possibilities, I thought about how much had changed in 18 months. I'd gone from barely able to function to building a life I actually wanted to live, from isolated and ashamed to surrounded by community, from convinced I was broken beyond repair to understanding that wholeness could include struggle. The anxiety hadn't disappeared. Just that day, I'd had a moment of panic while driving, that familiar tightness in my chest, the racing thoughts, the sense that something terrible was about to happen. But I'd pulled over, done my breathing exercises, challenged the thoughts, and within 10 minutes I was okay again. The panic had come and gone, like weather passing through. It hadn't derailed my day. That was healing. Not the absence of symptoms, but the ability to manage symptoms. Not perfection, but progress. Not being cured, but being empowered. The following Sunday, Pastor David asked me to share an update on the mental health ministry during announcements. I stood on stage and said, 18 months ago, I stood on my apartment balcony, drowning in anxiety, and prayed a desperate prayer, and God spoke to me. He said, "When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace." That phrase changed my life, and it's become the foundation of our mental health ministry, teaching people to recognize God's voice above the noise of mental illness. I shared statistics, 8 support groups, 200 people served over the past year, partnerships with local therapists, crisis interventions that had literally saved lives. But the numbers don't tell the whole story, I said. The story is in the faces. The person who finally admitted they were suicidal and got help. The family that learned to support their teen with OCD instead of dismissing it. The man who'd been ashamed of taking antidepressants for 20 years, who finally found permission to do what was helping him. The woman who realized her grief wasn't a sign of weak faith, but a normal response to profound loss. One person at a time, one conversation at a time, one story at a time. That's how the culture changes. After the service, 7 new people asked about joining support groups. The need was endless, it seemed. But so was the grace to meet that need. That evening I stood on my balcony one more time. The same spot where it had all begun 18 months ago. The same railing I'd gripped while convinced my life was falling apart. The same view of the city that had felt overwhelming and hopeless. But I was different. The view was still the same, but I was seeing it through different eyes. I thought about everything I'd learned in 18 months. That healing is a process, not an event, that vulnerability is strength, not weakness, that asking for help is wisdom, not failure, that mental illness is a human condition, not a spiritual deficiency, that medication and faith can coexist beautifully, that community is essential for survival, that pain can be transformed into purpose, that God's voice is always available, even when our minds are screaming. My phone buzzed. A text from Grace, thinking about you, love you, proud of you. Another text from Rachel, the kids are asking when Uncle Thomas is coming to visit again. They miss you. An email notification, someone who'd heard me speak at the conference, wanting to connect me with a church that needed mental health training. A calendar reminder, therapy session with Dr. Warren next week, the monthly check-in that kept me accountable and supported. I had a life now. Not a perfect life, there was no such thing, but a real life, a full life, a life that included struggle, but wasn't defined by struggle. When your mind screams, listen to my voice of peace. I whispered it into the evening air, a prayer of gratitude for the phrase that had carried me through 18 months, for the God who'd spoken it, for the journey it had initiated. The mind would probably always scream sometimes. Anxiety would probably be my companion for life. The thoughts would probably always try to catastrophize, to predict disaster, to convince me I was inadequate. But I knew now that the screaming didn't have to win, that alongside the noise of anxiety, there was always another voice, a voice that spoke truth when fear spoke lies, a voice that offered peace when panic threatened, a voice that reminded me day after day, moment after moment, I'm with you, you're not alone, you're going to be okay. And I'd keep listening to that voice for however many days, months, years I had ahead, because that voice, God's voice of peace, was the difference between merely surviving and actually thriving, between isolation and community, between shame and healing, between screaming and peace. My name is Thomas, and 18 months ago God spoke to me when my mind was screaming. He taught me to listen for his voice of peace, and that made all the difference. If you're reading this and your mind is screaming right now, if you're drowning in anxiety, depression, intrusive thoughts, panic, I want you to know you're not alone. God hasn't abandoned you. His voice of peace is available to you right now, even in the midst of your struggle. Get help, talk to a therapist, see a doctor if needed, build community, be honest about your struggle. Use the tools that work: medication, therapy, faith practices, support groups, all of it together. And most importantly, learn to listen for that other voice. The voice underneath the screaming, the voice that speaks truth, the voice of peace. It's there. I promise you, it's there. You just have to learn to hear it. And when you do, everything changes.